You're being played. Not by a person, not even by a system, but by something invisible etched into the very fabric of how humans think. It's not manipulation in the way you've heard it. It's not even deception. It's logic, strategy, survival. Behind every conversation, every relationship, every choice you make, there's a hidden framework at work. A structure so powerful it can predict how countries go to war, how businesses compete, how lovers argue, and even how animals hunt. It's called game theory. At its core, game theory is the study of decision-making when the outcome depends not just on your actions, but on someone else's. It's the science of strategy, of anticipating the move of the other player before they've even made it. And you're a player, whether you know it or not, when you avoid texting first, when you pretend not to care, when you wait to see what they'll do. That's not just emotion, that's instinct wrapped in strategy, a subconscious calculation of risk, reward, and reaction. Game theory explains why cooperation breaks down, why people betray each other, why being rational doesn't always lead to the best outcome. It gave us the prisoner's dilemma, the Nash equilibrium, and the logic behind everything from poker to politics. But here's the terrifying part. You can do everything right and still lose, because the other player might be playing a different game, because fairness isn't the rule, it's the illusion, and because the strategies that once helped you survive might be the very ones holding you back now. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we'll explore invisible traps designed by game theory, traps that shape how you love, compete, forgive, fight, and survive. Not to scare you, but to open your eyes. Because life isn't just a story, it's a game, and it's time you learned the rules. Why everyone loses if no one moves. Imagine a burning theater. Smoke curls toward the ceiling. The fire alarm hasn't gone off. Everyone smells it, feels the heat building, but no one stands. People glance around, waiting. If you rush for the exit now, you might look crazy, overreacting, embarrassing yourself. But if you don't move, and no one else does either, you all burn. That's the paradox. You wait for someone else to act. They wait for you. And in that pause, the cost of inaction multiplies. Not because people are stupid, but because they're calculating. Each person is thinking, what will everyone else do? What happens if I'm wrong? Will I be judged, left alone, punished for acting first? This is the core of what game theorists call the Nash equilibrium, a situation where everyone is making the best decision they can based on what they expect others to do, and no one has anything to gain by changing unless someone else does first. It's balance, but a dangerous one. Now move beyond the theater, into real life, a toxic relationship, a friend who's pulling away, a workplace where nobody speaks up about the obvious dysfunction. Everyone's waiting for someone else to go first. Everyone's afraid of sticking out, standing alone, risking being wrong. And so, nothing changes ever. In war, this becomes a standoff. In love, a stalemate. In society, stagnation. The Nash equilibrium doesn't require coordination, just quiet resignation. Everyone calculating in isolation, locking themselves into a group failure. It's not about what you want, it's about what you predict. And if everyone's prediction says wait, the outcome becomes a silent mutual collapse. You see it in dating. Two people attracted to each other, waiting for the other to text first. In politics, parties refusing to change position, even when the old strategy is losing voters. In climate change, nations holding off action until someone else sacrifices first. It's not because no one cares. It's because everyone's trapped in a logic loop that rewards inaction. And here's the chilling part. The longer it holds, the more permanent it feels. The equilibrium becomes the norm. The standoff becomes the system. You stop thinking it could ever be different. You forget what movement even looks like. To break it, someone has to lose first. Someone has to risk being the fool, the villain, the one who tried something that didn't work, and most people, understandably, aren't willing. So we stay seated in the smoke. But what if the problem isn't just the fear of moving? What if the problem is invisible entirely, a game we've been playing without knowing we ever agreed to? What if you're already playing and you never even saw the board? Let's flip the lights on. The game you didn't know you're in. You walk into a room and instinctively scan it. Not for threats, not for exits, but for the unspoken rules. Where do people sit? Who's being listened to? Who interrupts? Who laughs first? What's okay to say here and what's not? You do all this before you even open your mouth. Because long before you were taught mathematics or philosophy or grammar, you were taught how to play the game of human interaction. And the strangest part, no one ever explained the rules. You just absorbed them. Through silence, through stares, through 1,000 tiny rewards and punishments you didn't even know were shaping you. This game isn't in a book. It's in glances, in pauses, in who gets invited, who gets ignored, who gets punished for breaking a norm that was never made explicit in the first place. It's the game of fitting in, of surviving, of being just enough of yourself to feel authentic, but not so much that you threaten the tribe. The game says, don't be too different, too slow, too smart, too emotional, too needy, too confident. Just stay between the lines. Don't make anyone uncomfortable. Don't remind people of things they'd rather forget. And because we want love and safety and to belong, we play, even if we don't realize it. This is what game theory understands so brutally well, that most human behavior doesn't come from pure logic or clear incentives, but from deeply embedded patterns, scripts, mental models, invisible negotiations where every choice you make is shaped by what others might think, even when they never say a word. Consider how you answer the question, how are you? Most people don't tell the truth, not because they're lying, but because they're participating in the game. The point isn't honesty. It's maintaining emotional equilibrium. You say good so they can say good too, and you both move on. This isn't deception. It's strategy. It's mutual gameplay to avoid the emotional cost of vulnerability. And once you see this, you start to notice it everywhere. You notice that some compliments are power moves, that some apologies are manipulations, that some silences scream louder than arguments. You realize that everyone is gaining something, even when they think they're being genuine. But here's the trap. Because the game is invisible, people mistake it for truth. They believe that the approval they chase is authentic, that the opinions they hold are entirely their own, that the self they present is the self they are. They don't see the game board. They only see the moves they're told to make. And maybe that's the darkest part. You can't change a game you don't know you're playing. You can't opt out if you don't even know where the boundaries are. You live according to rules you never examined, values you never chose, goals you never questioned. And by the time you do see it, you've already shaped your identity around a script someone else wrote. Which raises a haunting question. If your reality is a performance crafted for a world that rewards compliance, then what exactly are you protecting when you say it's your truth? Or more precisely, how much of your life is built on lies that felt logical when you first believed them? The logic behind the lies we live. A man works a job he hates for a car he doesn't need to impress people he doesn't like. Ask him why, and he'll give you reasons. Logical ones. Stability. Image, responsibility, a stepping stone. He'll talk about being smart and doing the right thing. But something deeper is going on. Because beneath his words is a system, not just a personal system of beliefs, but a collective logic we all inherit. A logic that tells us which lies are acceptable and which truths are too dangerous to speak. Game theory doesn't just live in economics or war rooms. It thrives in daily life, in marriages, in friendships, in boardrooms, on Instagram, and sometimes the most strategic move isn't deception of others, but self-deception. the elegant maneuver of believing something just enough to make life livable. We tell ourselves we're kind because we don't yell, that we're honest because we avoid lying outright, that we're free because we chose from a list of options someone else wrote. We wear these narratives like armor, but armor, as it turns out, is heavy. Why do we lie to ourselves? Not always out of cowardice, but often out of coordination. We're trying to keep our mental model of the world intact. A cohesive illusion lets us function. If we questioned every assumption, every social norm, every truth we've repeated without scrutiny, we'd collapse under existential weight. You can't wake up every day wondering if love is real, if your job is meaningful, if morality exists, so you settle on an internal game plan. Not because it's true, but because it's stable. You lie just enough to keep moving. Take the illusion of meritocracy. We like to believe success is earned through effort, intelligence, grit. It's a comforting frame. But dig deeper and it cracks. What about luck, timing, privilege, nepotism, structural inequality? Acknowledging these doesn't just challenge society, it threatens identity. Because if your wins weren't solely earned, then who are you, really? And this is where logic becomes camouflage. We rationalize. We edit our memories to make our choices look consistent. We cherry-pick examples that validate what we already feel. The mind doesn't seek truth, it seeks coherence. Game theory calls this a coordination mechanism, a shared fiction that lets people operate under assumed agreements. Society is held together not just by laws, but by illusions we silently agree not to question. That your parents knew what they were doing. That good things happen to good people. That hard work always pays off. That you're nothing like those people you judge. We lie, and the world thanks us for it. Because if too many people stopped playing, stopped nodding politely, stopped pretending they believe, it would unravel. And so instead of breaking the spell, most people double down. They make moves not because they're optimal, but because they're expected. Because being unpredictable is dangerous. Because disrupting the narrative feels like social suicide. Even when the payoff is small, we stay in the game. Even when it hurts, we play our part. And nowhere is this more visible, more twisted, more tragic than in the decisions we make with others. The silent agreements, the invisible negotiations, the moments when doing what's best feels like betrayal, and doing what's right means losing everything. That's the territory we're entering next. Because once you've seen how people build their lives on strategic lies, the next question is brutal. What happens when two players want to win, but can only win by betraying each other? That's where the everyday prisoner's dilemma begins. The everyday prisoner's dilemma. Imagine this. You and a coworker are tasked with finishing a project. You can either give it your all or slack off and hope they carry the weight. They face the same choice. If you both give full effort, you share the reward. If only one of you works hard, the slacker benefits more, and if you both slack off, the project fails and you both lose. You've just stepped into a prisoner's dilemma, and you didn't even know it. Originally a thought experiment in game theory, the classic version involves two prisoners being interrogated separately. If both stay silent, they get light sentences. If one betrays the other, the betrayer walks free, and the silent one suffers. If both betray, both suffer, but not as much as the silent victim. So what's the rational move? Betray. Because no matter what the other does, betrayal gives the better personal outcome. But here's the tragedy. When both think this way, they both lose more than they would have by cooperating. Now translate that to real life. Your romantic partner messes up. You could forgive or punish. If you punish, you might protect yourself. But if both partners respond that way over time, the relationship erodes. Or think about traffic. Everyone wants to get home faster. But if each driver cuts corners, switching lanes aggressively, ignoring signals, the system collapses into chaos. Rational self-interest causes collective failure. The prisoner's dilemma isn't rare. It's everywhere. In politics, countries build weapons just in case, and arms races spiral. In business, companies undercut each other until quality collapses. In friendships, we hesitate to be vulnerable, afraid the other won't meet us halfway. So we both hold back, both lose trust, and both feel alone. The real danger. It feels rational. You tell yourself you're protecting yourself, but in doing so, you create the very outcome you fear. And then, next time, you cooperate even less. It becomes a feedback loop of suspicion and self-interest, a slow erosion of connection built on perfectly logical choices. And even when you're aware of it, even when you want to trust, the voice whispers, "What if they don't?" Trust becomes a gamble, and most people fold early. But why? Why is cooperation, something we're told is natural, even noble, so fragile, so short-lived? Why does the very thing that binds us fall apart so quickly, so often in so many parts of life? Let's take a closer look. Because understanding that failure might be the only way to stop it. Why cooperation fails so easily? You want to believe people will work together when it matters. That when survival depends on unity, when progress demands partnership, we'll choose collaboration over conflict. But more often than not, that hope shatters. Because cooperation, while beautiful in theory, is built on a fault line. We assume people are rational, but in real life, people aren't calculating expected value like machines. They're nursing wounds, guarding pride, projecting insecurities, and when trust gets even slightly bruised, it doesn't heal, it calcifies into caution. We fear being the fool, the one who gives too much, too soon, too openly. Because history teaches us something brutal, the cooperative often get exploited before they get rewarded. So we hold back, we wait for proof, and everyone else does the same. The result? A world of cautious players sitting around a table, each waiting for the others to make the first move. No one folds. No one commits. Everyone watches. Everyone calculates. But nothing meaningful is ever built. Now add time pressure. Add stakes. Add conflicting incentives. And suddenly, even when people want to cooperate, they don't know how. One wrong move, one misread signal, and the whole system implodes. Cooperation demands clarity, but most systems, social, political, economic, are murky, full of gray zones, mixed messages, competing goals. It's not that people are evil, it's that coordination is hard. Take group projects. Each person wonders, will the others do their part, so they do less, which leads others to do even less. Eventually, everyone's disappointed. Everyone thinks they were the only one trying. No one was. Or think bigger, international climate agreements. Everyone benefits from a cleaner planet, but each country hesitates because the short-term cost of changing hurts, and no one wants to pay that price unless others do too. But no one goes first, so no one moves at all. This isn't just a social problem, it's hardwired. Game theorists have shown that in many real-world conditions, especially when players don't know each other well or when the game has no clear end, defection becomes the dominant strategy, even if it makes things worse for everyone long-term. And the more we experience betrayal, even small ones, the coworker who takes credit, the friend who ghosts, the stranger who cuts in line, the more we encode a worldview where cooperation feels naive, where kindness feels dangerous. So we retreat. We smile, but don't open up. We nod, but don't commit. We build walls, then wonder why no one joins us behind them. Worse still, many people learn to weaponize this environment. They act cooperative just long enough to extract value, to build trust they never intended to honor. It's not just betrayal, it's a strategy. And in a world full of masks, how do you spot the honest faces? Which brings us to the next dark realization. Not everyone is playing to win fairly. Some are bluffing, constantly. And the terrifying part is, they're getting away with it. Let's explore how. The bluff everyone is playing. You walk into a room and smile, nod at the right moment, say what's expected. They do the same. Everyone seems confident, composed, in control. But look closer. Underneath the polished surface, something else is happening. Everyone is bluffing. Quietly, constantly, desperately trying not to be found out. It starts early. Childhood teaches us that appearances matter, that confidence is rewarded, that doubt must be hidden. And so, little by little, we craft a version of ourselves that looks stronger than it feels. We learn to act like we know, even when we don't. To pretend we care, even when we're numb. To bluff, not in malice, but in survival. In game theory, bluffing is a strategy. It's not a lie exactly. It's a bet, a calculated move to control perception. You raise your voice, not because you're sure, but because you want them to think you are. You post the polished photo, not because life is good, but because you can't afford for them to think it's falling apart. This isn't just in poker rooms or negotiation tables. It's everywhere. At work, someone throws out a statistic in a meeting. You nod, even though you have no idea if it's true. You bluff understanding to maintain status. So does everyone else. The bluff becomes contagious. In dating, people amplify what they think others want to see. More ambition, less vulnerability. More stability, less truth. The real self is shelved in favor of the playable self. On social media, the bluff is the baseline. Every scroll feeds the illusion that others are thriving. And in response, we feel pressure to project the same. Even if our day was hollow, even if we cried in the bathroom, the bluff gets dressed up, filtered, and posted. And the more it works, the more we rely on it. Because here's the trick. Bluffing often succeeds. Confidence, real or not, creates momentum. People follow the loudest voice, not always the wisest. They assume certainty equals credibility. And so those who master the bluff climb higher, faster, further. But there's a cost. The more we bluff, the less room we leave for authenticity. Vulnerability becomes dangerous. Honesty feels risky. And the self, already fractured, becomes harder to access beneath layers of performance. You start forgetting what you actually believe. You confuse your poker face with your personality. You wonder if anyone sees the real you, or if they're just responding to your mask. And worst of all, you begin to distrust others too. Because if you're bluffing and it's working, maybe they are too. Maybe everyone's bluffing. Maybe the whole system runs on mutual deception, each person pretending just enough to keep the game going. This isn't just exhausting, it's corrosive. It erodes intimacy, because real connection demands exposure. It weakens institutions, because trust becomes brittle. And it leaves us more alone than we realize, surrounded by people we don't fully believe. Yet the bluff continues. Because we think we have no choice. Because showing weakness might mean losing. And in a game where perception is power, silence can be a louder strategy than truth. But here's the irony. Even bluffing depends on something fragile. Your reputation. Without it, your moves lose weight. Your strategies lose effect. And the game once tilted in your favor turns against you. Because in the end, people don't just judge what you do. They remember who you are. And that memory, true or false, becomes a currency of its own. Your reputation is a currency. You don't carry it in your wallet. You can't hold it or weigh it. But every room you enter, every silence you break, every move you make, it's there. Your reputation. And in the invisible economy of human behavior, it spends like money. In game theory, this isn't just poetic language. It's literal strategy. Reputation shapes expectation. Expectation guides reaction. And in games where the future matters, your past becomes a form of leverage. Imagine two players locked in a repeated game. Tit for tat. Move for move. The only thing that prevents betrayal is the memory of betrayal. And so if you're seen as fair, reliable, even a little ruthless when crossed, others will act accordingly. They'll cooperate, or back off, not because they trust your goodness, but because they believe in your consistency. This is the strange paradox. Reputation isn't about who you are. It's about what people expect you to do. A kind act doesn't make you kind. A cruel move doesn't make you cruel, but do it often enough, or do it when it counts, and the world starts to assign you a label. You become trustworthy, or risky, or manipulative. And that label follows you, like a shadow that enters the room before you do. And once it's there, it becomes harder to shed than skin. In business, your reputation determines who signs deals, who returns your calls, who whispers your name in meetings you're not invited to. In relationships, it shapes who confides in you, who distances from you, who believes your apology. Online, it's even more extreme. One post, one sentence, one moment taken out of context can brand you forever. But here's where it gets darker. Reputation doesn't need to be true. It only needs to be believed. If you're seen as competent, people overlook your failures. If you're seen as unstable, they question your success. The narrative shapes the facts, not the other way around. And like currency, reputation can inflate, deflate, be stolen, be forged. A charismatic liar can build a fortune of false trust. A quiet genius can be dismissed for lack of branding. One rumor, one scandal, one misunderstanding can crash a person like a stock market collapse. And once the fall begins, the system that once praised you turns silent, if not hostile. So what do? We curate, manage, preen. We calculate what to say, what to post, what to admit. We weigh how honesty might be twisted, how silence might be interpreted. We rehearse casualness, sculpt authenticity, all to protect the currency we never physically touch but can't afford to lose. And some become obsessed. They no longer live for experience, they live for impression. They make choices not based on desire, but on optics. They don't ask, "Do I want this?" They ask, "How will this look?" And their life becomes a performance staged for a jury that never leaves the room. But even the perfect reputation is a fragile wealth, because it relies on others, and others are fickle, prone to jealousy, misinformation, projection. One day you're admired, the next, misunderstood, the day after, forgotten. Yet in the strange logic of strategy, this impermanence doesn't weaken reputation, it heightens its value. It forces you to consider every move like an investment. To know that your decisions echo beyond the moment, that the impression you leave today may return tomorrow as a handshake, a warning, or a closed door. And so reputation is a currency, but it's also a mirror. It reflects not just who you are, but who you've been pretending to be. And the game doesn't stop there. Because once you're known, once your pattern is familiar, you become predictable. And in a world of strategy, predictability has a cost. The cost of being predictable. Predictability is comfortable. It makes you seem stable, trustworthy, consistent, but comfort, in the language of strategy, is often code for weakness. Because if they can read your moves before you make them, you're no longer playing a game, you're following a script someone else can rewrite. In game theory, the predictable player is the most exploitable one. Their intentions are clear, their reactions expected, their habits map-like. And once others know your map, they can design traps right on your path. You become less a competitor, more a machine, useful but not dangerous. Think about the coworker who always agrees, the partner who never disagrees, the friend who always forgives. Their roles become set pieces, their kindness, their patience, even their reliability once admirable become liabilities. Why? Because there's no cost to crossing them. No surprise. No edge. This isn't about becoming deceptive. It's about becoming unreadable. Unpredictability isn't chaos. It's strategic ambiguity. In poker, you don't win by always bluffing or always folding. You win by making others unsure which version of you is at the table. That doubt is power. Even animals understand this. A threatened cobra doesn't always strike. It might display, retreat, or attack, but the uncertainty alone wards off danger. In evolutionary games, the organisms that survive aren't the strongest, but those who make others second-guess their moves. Predictable patterns get hunted. Unpredictable ones stay alive. In your life, every habit becomes a tell. How you answer texts, how you react to criticism, the rhythms of your silence, the places where you always yield. These are all strategic exposures. Places where others can calculate your behavior and shape the outcome before you're aware the game has started. And yet, we love predictability in others. It gives us control. It makes the world feel less chaotic. But ask yourself, how many of your relationships are rooted in that control? How many people count on your consistency, not because they value you, but because they rely on your inability to surprise them? That's the deeper cost. Not just being outmaneuvered, but being quietly reduced to a background character in someone else's strategy. So once in a while, veer off script. Don't answer the expected way. Let them wonder, even briefly, what version of you just walked into the room. Let them recalculate. Because when they no longer can, you're not a player, you're a piece. And in the spaces where people think the stakes are low, where the game is casual, where the words are light, that's often where the real calculations begin. Strategy hidden in small talk. It sounds harmless, almost forgettable. Nice weather today. How was your weekend? Did you catch the game? Small talk feels like the background noise of life, a filler between the real conversations. But what if that filler is the game? Game theory teaches that not all moves are loud. Some are whispers, some are smiles, some are pauses. In fact, the most crucial strategies are often buried in the rituals we consider meaningless, because small talk isn't about information. It's about mapping territory, establishing tone, gauging alignment. Before war, there's always a smile. When two people talk about the weather, they're not talking about the weather. They're watching for rhythm, for openness, for mood. They're asking, are we in sync? Do you mirror me? Are you safe to engage with? Or a threat in disguise? These questions aren't conscious, but they shape everything that follows. Consider how quickly small talk reveals power. The one who asks first is often the one seeking permission. The one who answers vaguely might be signaling disinterest or self-protection. The one who changes topic wields control. Every micro-decision, when to speak, when to nod, when to shift eye contact, becomes a signal. And these signals aren't random. They're currency. Your tone of voice might signal confidence or submission. Your pacing might say, I have time for you, or I'm just being polite. Even the choice of topic becomes a kind of handshake. Sports suggest tribal affiliation, weather suggests neutrality, personal stories signal intimacy or bait. In strategy terms, this is information asymmetry. You're revealing pieces of yourself to gather data about the other, and the better you are at disguising your motives, the more advantage you hold. Job interviews, filled with strategic small talk. First dates, entirely shaped by micro-calibrated impressions. Boardrooms, coffee machine pleasantries often carry more weight than formal agendas. In all of these, small talk is the performance before the deal, the dress rehearsal for trust or betrayal. And here's the unsettling truth. The people who excel at this, who use small talk not to connect but to measure, often win. They sense vulnerabilities faster. They reframe narratives before anyone realizes one is being written, because the game doesn't start when you say something important. It starts when you say something unimportant, and see how they respond. This is why silence in small talk is dangerous. It's not neutral, it's a missed move, a skipped line in the script. And when you don't move, the other player gains control. They set the tempo. They define the mood. They lead. But there's one layer deeper. Sometimes, small talk isn't just a test. It's bait. Flattery, empathy, even gentle jokes can draw out information, force reciprocation, lower defenses, and once you're open, the strategy slips through. So next time you say, "How's it going?" remember you're not just being polite. You're setting a scene. You're choosing a mask. You're stepping onto a stage where stakes are rarely acknowledged, but always present. And in that soft, smiling battlefield, kindness becomes a tactic too. Kindness is tactical signaling. We like to think of kindness as pure, as something untouched by calculation or motive. A smile given freely, a favor with no strings. But game theory has a different lens, and once you look through it, the shine of kindness begins to look like a reflection of strategy. Imagine two individuals in a game. One helps the other from the outside. It looks generous. But zoom in. That kind act might establish debt. It might alter status. It might place the helper in a moral spotlight that pays off later. Because in a system where every move creates ripple effects, kindness is rarely a standalone event. It's a signal. In evolutionary game theory, signaling is everything. Birds puff up their feathers not just for warmth, but to look dominant. Flowers evolve bright colors, not just to look beautiful, but to attract pollinators. Likewise, humans display kindness not just to be good, but to be seen as good, to signal trustworthiness, generosity, safety. And that signal, when received, often yields rewards, cooperation, loyalty, social elevation. Consider how we behave in front of others. You open a door for someone and glance to see if anyone noticed. You tip the waiter more when dining with company. You donate to charity and post about it. The act may be real, but the broadcast is strategic. It's reputation management, social currency, tactical signaling disguised as virtue. This isn't always conscious. That's what makes it so effective. Kindness as a signal works best when it feels authentic, even to the person offering it. But the evolutionary drive is still there, humming underneath. Helping others enhances your standing. It strengthens alliances. It increases your value in the game of survival. And in high-stakes environments, the signaling intensifies. Political campaigns are built on staged kindness, kissing babies, shaking hands, showing empathy on camera. Corporations craft billion-dollar marketing campaigns around social responsibility. Even apologies from public figures are often less about remorse and more about brand damage control. These aren't acts of the heart. They're plays on the board. But it goes deeper. Sometimes kindness is used to manipulate. Compliments become compliance. Favors become control. This is the dark art of reciprocal obligation. You do something kind, not to give, but to trap, to make refusal feel rude, to make the recipient owe you something. And because humans are wired for fairness, it works. We feel the pressure to return kindness, even when the kindness was calculated. Even in intimate relationships, kindness carries weight. Who gives more? Who initiates repair? Who listens more attentively? These aren't just signs of care. They're tallied acts, moves that shape future responses. A kind partner builds leverage for when things go wrong. An unkind one chips away at future cooperation. It's all still game theory, just wearing the clothes of emotion. And yet, none of this means kindness is fake. That's the real paradox. A strategic move can still be sincere. A signal can be both calculated and caring. The brain doesn't need to choose between truth and tactic. It often blends them because blending them is what makes the signal powerful. So the next time someone does something kind, pause. Not to distrust, but to observe what's being offered, what's being signaled, what's the potential return. And as you watch those layers unfold, you might begin to notice something deeper still. That even altruism, our highest form of kindness, may not be as selfless as it seems. Altruism isn't what it seems. We like to think of altruism as humanity's noblest trait, a selfless act, a sacrifice with no expectation of return. The stranger who jumps into a river to save someone drowning, the person who gives away their last meal, the neighbor who donates a kidney to someone they'll never meet. These stories move us because they seem to stand outside the cold logic of gain and loss. But what if they don't? Game theory whispers a darker possibility that even altruism, the very thing we hold above the strategic mess of the world, may be embedded within it. That behind many acts of generosity lie invisible calculations, some social, some biological, some evolutionary, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. In evolutionary biology, altruism poses a problem. Why would a creature reduce its own chances of survival to benefit another? That question drove decades of research, until scientists proposed a solution. Maybe it's not selfless at all. Maybe it's a longer game. One explanation is kin selection, the idea that helping your relatives helps your genes survive. A mother sacrifices for her child because, genetically speaking, they're the same team. But that doesn't explain why we help strangers, why we donate to people we've never met, why we risk ourselves for those with nothing to offer in return. That's where reciprocal altruism comes in. We help others because over time it pays off, not immediately, not obviously, but socially, reputationally, emotionally. People who are generous are more likely to receive help in the future. They build trust, they gain allies. In the economy of survival, altruism buys insurance. And then there's the costly signaling theory, which says the more it hurts to give, the more powerful the message it sends. A wealthy person giving $10 to charity isn't impressive, but someone struggling who gives half their paycheck. That act, though dangerous, sends a signal of moral strength, reliability, loyalty, and in the long run, those traits are rewarded. People trust you, protect you, follow you. This might sound cold, but even in everyday life, we see how altruism becomes social glue. You pick up the tab at dinner, you help someone move. You spend hours listening to a friend vent. Do you do it from love? Of course. But love is not free of structure. Every act builds a kind of ledger, emotional, not financial. And game theory doesn't care about the currency, only the exchange. The most unsettling form of altruism, though, might be the strategic sacrifice. This is when someone gives, knowing it creates future leverage. The person who always helps so they can call in a favor later. The charity that donates publicly for the PR boost. The friend who's always generous but keeps quiet score. This isn't kindness, it's influence. But perhaps the most dangerous illusion is when we use altruism to feel superior, to boost our self-image, to silence guilt, to avoid discomfort. I did my part, we tell ourselves. I'm a good person. And just like that, the act becomes more about identity than impact, more about self-preservation than self-sacrifice. And yet none of this strips altruism of its power. In fact, its strategic roots may be the very reason it works. Because in a world of uncertainty where trust is rare and betrayal is easy, a well-timed gift, a real sacrifice, a quiet favor, these gestures stand out. They earn something deep, something lasting. Still, you might wonder if our kindest acts are influenced by hidden motives. What does that say about us? Maybe it says we're complex, that we're creatures who can both care and calculate, that we're driven by love and logic, that the line between giving and gaining is blurrier than we admit. And once you see how even altruism plays into the rules of the social game, you might start to question other behaviors too, like politeness. Because the next mask we wear is the one that smiles while hiding what we really mean. The politeness game trap. You're in line at a cafe. Someone cuts in front of you. You're annoyed, maybe even insulted, but you say nothing. You smile tightly, pretend not to care, and let it slide. Why? Because saying something would be rude. Because you don't want to cause a scene. Because being polite matters more than being right. But who decided that? Politeness feels like a virtue. It's what keeps society running smoothly, right? A shared code of decency, a buffer against chaos. But game theory suggests something more unsettling, that politeness is often not a sign of kindness, but a strategy of control, a subtle agreement not to disrupt the illusion of harmony, even when that illusion hides discomfort, danger, or manipulation. In game theoretic terms, Politeness is a coordination strategy. It helps people navigate uncertain social situations without escalating tension. It minimizes risk. Saying the right thing ensures mutual cooperation, or at least prevents social punishment, and often that's useful. It's efficient. It avoids unnecessary conflict. But efficiency isn't always truth. And when politeness becomes the dominant rule, it creates a strange paradox. People stop saying what they mean. They smile while they're furious. They laugh when they're hurt. They agree while internally screaming. Because the cost of honesty, social awkwardness, judgment, rejection feels higher than the benefit of self-expression. Over time, this creates asymmetric games. One person plays with full awareness of their wants. The other plays defensively, avoiding offense at all costs. Guess who wins? Consider the deference trap. You let someone talk over you. You don't correct the rude boss. You tolerate a friend's passive aggression. Why? Because you've been trained, perhaps for decades, to avoid appearing difficult, especially if you're from a group that's been socially conditioned to prioritize harmony over self-assertion. Politeness becomes a mask, not just to hide emotions, but to protect others from having to confront them. You're taught to be pleasant, digestible, agreeable, and while that may keep the peace, it also keeps you small. It prevents authentic negotiation, and in game theory, negotiation is where real outcomes change. Worse, politeness can be exploited as a shield. People with power often rely on the politeness of others to avoid accountability. They count on you not to speak up, not to push back, not to embarrass them. The more polite you are, the more they can act without resistance. This is especially true in hierarchical games, like the workplace, academia, or even family structures. The unspoken rule is maintain the hierarchy, even if it means silencing your own truth. The cost of honesty is steep. The reward for politeness, social approval, temporary comfort, a quiet seat at the table until the table turns. And then there's toxic politeness, when the collective agreement to keep things nice prevents any real progress. In teams, in communities, in relationships, everyone is being polite. No one is being real. And because no one wants to be the first to disrupt the illusion, the problems fester in silence. The game rewards the surface, not the substance. And here's the trap: politeness feels like morality, but it's often just strategy, a tool to manage impressions, a way to delay discomfort. It teaches us that truth is dangerous, that conflict is failure, that our needs are a burden. But in doing so, it sets us up for something worse: powerlessness. So the next time you bite your tongue, ask yourself, is this courtesy or self-erasure? Is this cooperation or submission? Are you choosing peace or avoiding a necessary war? Because behind the mask of manners lies something deeper, a system that trains you to be agreeable until you no longer remember how to disagree. And that leads us directly into the next trap: how society conditions you from a young age to be easily managed, easily predicted, and dangerously exploitable. How you're trained to be exploitable. From the moment you can speak, you're told to behave. Be polite. Wait your turn. Don't interrupt. Say please and thank you. Clean your plate. Respect your elders. Be grateful. Don't ask for too much. At first glance, it all sounds innocent, just the rules of being a good person. But peel back the surface, and you'll find something more calculated. You're not just being taught how to live with others. You're being conditioned, trained to make yourself easier to manage, easier to predict, and easier to exploit. Game theory doesn't deal in morality. It deals in incentives, strategies, and outcomes. And when you grow up inside a system designed to prioritize control over curiosity, obedience over individuality, that system is shaping you into a specific kind of player, the compliant one. Think about school, not education. School, a rigid hierarchy. A bell rings, you move. A question's asked, you raise your hand. There's one correct answer, and it's already in the textbook. Don't challenge the authority. Don't speak out of turn. Memorize, obey, pass. This isn't just about learning. It's about learning how not to question, not to resist, not to imagine alternatives. The reward for conformity is approval. The punishment for deviation is isolation, shame, or punishment. That's not education. That's domestication. Now scale it up. Workplaces reward the most professional behavior, which often means silence in the face of injustice. Friendships reward you for nodding along, not for challenging lies. Relationships can punish honesty if it disturbs comfort. Over time, you become fluent in suppression. Because the game you were taught is this: keep the peace, even if you have to sacrifice your needs. Why do so many people struggle to set boundaries? Because from childhood, setting boundaries was interpreted as selfishness. Why do so many avoid confrontation? Because they were taught confrontation equals conflict, and conflict equals failure. You've been wired for loss aversion, trained to believe that avoiding discomfort is better than chasing fulfillment. It's not your fault. It's the game board you were placed on before you even knew there were rules. But the dark twist is this: once conditioned, you become ripe for exploitation. Employers know you won't ask for a raise. Marketers know you'll chase approval through products. Manipulators know you'll fear being disliked more than being used. You become a character in someone else's strategy, a pawn in a game you didn't choose to play. And the longer you stay unaware, the easier it is for others to keep winning. There's even a name for this in behavioral economics: learned helplessness. When repeated attempts to resist or escape a negative situation are punished, eventually, you stop trying. You accept the script. You stay in your lane. You normalize discomfort, and the worst part, you call it maturity. But what if that maturity was just resignation? Reclaiming agency means recognizing the games you've been conditioned to lose. It means seeing obedience not as a virtue but as a strategy, one that benefits others more than it benefits you. It means understanding that discomfort isn't danger, that saying no doesn't make you bad, that resistance isn't rebellion, it's clarity. Because the truth is, exploitation isn't always a dramatic event. Sometimes it's just you saying yes when you meant no, smiling when you feel hollow, shrinking when you should expand. And as you begin to question this system, something peculiar happens. You start noticing where even your smiles aren't just emotions, but signals. Signals in another quiet but powerful game, the status game behind your smile. The status game behind your smile. You smile when someone enters the room. You smile when you're uncomfortable. You smile when you're praised, when you're passed over, when you're trying to get a word in, when you want to disappear. And most of the time, you don't even notice you're doing it. The human smile, supposedly the most universal sign of warmth, is not always about joy. Sometimes it's armor. Sometimes it's bait. Sometimes it's surrender. Game theory asks, what are the incentives? What strategy is at play? And when it comes to smiling, the answer is more strategic than sentimental. Smiles are social currency. A smile can signal deference. I'm not a threat. It can show alliance. We're on the same team. It can mask pain. I'm fine. Don't look deeper. In many interactions, especially in hierarchical structures, smiles become tools to manage perception, not reflections of inner truth. Think about how children learn to survive emotionally. They realize quickly that pleasing adults brings safety, attention, rewards, so they perform. They adjust their tone, posture, and expression to match the environment. By the time they reach adulthood, many no longer know whether a smile is genuine or tactical. It's become automatic. And in adult life, the game only gets more complex. You smile during interviews to appear agreeable. You smile at a rude customer to avoid escalation. You smile at family to keep the peace. Even when you're angry, especially when you're angry. Because somewhere inside, you've learned that being liked is safer than being honest. What's terrifying is that this strategy works. The agreeable are tolerated. The cheerful are trusted. The smiling are disarmed before they even speak. You earn more opportunities, more forgiveness, more space if you know how to project a well-timed grin. But what's the cost? When you smile to please rather than express, when your face becomes a mask for other people's comfort, when you feel more obligated to appear okay than to be okay, you become trapped in a loop where your needs are silenced and your truth is disguised as etiquette. This is especially true in power dynamics. In environments where dissent is punished, whether explicitly or subtly, smiles become survival. Women, for example, are socially conditioned to smile more than men, not because they're happier, but because society rewards their submission and penalizes their defiance. And here's the brutal game theory twist. In a signaling game, the appearance of positivity often matters more than the reality of experience. A smile becomes a status beacon. It tells others that you're in control, that you're composed, that you're above the struggle. Even if inside you're unraveling, smiling becomes a way to climb, not just socially but emotionally, because the person who smiles seems more likable, more competent, more secure. And being seen that way opens doors, softens judgments, wins favors, but it also reinforces the belief that performance is more valuable than authenticity. What's most disturbing is that the moment you stop playing, the moment you drop the smile and show discomfort, sadness, or frustration, the world treats you differently. You're seen as difficult, unstable, or negative. Not because you are, but because you broke the unspoken agreement. Keep smiling so the rest of us don't have to feel. This is the paradox. The smile that earns you approval can rob you of intimacy, because people start responding to the performance, not the person. They fall in love with the light you project, not the shadows you carry, and eventually even you might forget there's a difference. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone sees through it. Someone notices the tightness in the corners of your mouth, the sadness in your eyes, the silence between the laughs, and in those rare moments, you remember what it feels like to be seen, not managed. Yet even those rare moments can be risky, because when you finally let someone in, when you dare to trust, that trust can be twisted. It can become a weapon. And in the next game, vulnerability isn't just a risk, it's a strategic disadvantage waiting to be exploited. When trust becomes a weapon, we're told that trust is the foundation of every meaningful relationship, that to build love, friendship, loyalty, you must first surrender your defenses, let someone in, share your secrets, drop the mask. But game theory warns every move reveals something, and the more you reveal, the more someone else can use. Trust isn't just a warm feeling, it's an information exchange. When you trust someone, you give them a key to your vulnerabilities, your fears, your desires, your blind spots. And while most people handle that key gently, others treat it like a weapon. The cruelest players are those who act like allies until the moment they strike. In a strategic game, pretending to be trustworthy is often more effective than being trustworthy. Because once someone believes you're safe, they stop guarding themselves. They talk more freely. They show you where they're soft. And once you see that, once you know which buttons to push, it becomes easy to manipulate without them even noticing. This happens in relationships where someone stores up your confessions like ammunition. During a fight, suddenly your past traumas, your insecurities, your deepest fears are hurled back at you, repackaged as accusations or mockery. And in that moment, the room spins. You realize the intimacy you thought you had was a setup, a trap, a Trojan horse built from your own words. It happens in workplaces too. A colleague who asks how you're really doing might not be checking in, they might be checking for weakness. And weeks later, when you're up for a promotion, they've already hinted to the boss that you're a bit overwhelmed lately. Sometimes it's even more subtle. A friend nudges you toward bad decisions not out of malice, but because your failure makes them feel safer in their own. Or a partner dismisses your ambitions not because they don't believe in you, but because if you grow, you might outgrow them. In all these cases, trust is weaponized not through force, but through access. Game theory breaks this down into signaling, payoffs, and incentives. If someone benefits from your openness more than they benefit from your success, betrayal becomes the rational move, especially if they believe you'll never suspect it. And the worst part, you often don't. We tend to believe our instincts are good, that we'd feel it if someone was using us. But that's the illusion of transparency, thinking our gut will alert us to deception. In reality, the best manipulators aren't cold or cruel. They're warm, curious, attentive. They listen better than anyone else. And they do it not out of care, but calculation. Because to win a game of trust, you don't need to play fair. You just need to play patiently. And once your defenses are down, once they know your moves before you make them, they don't even need to attack. They can simply guide you where they want you to go. This is what makes betrayal so disorienting. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like a revelation. That moment when you realize the very person you leaned on was slowly pulling the ground out from under you. So what's the solution? Never trust anyone? Build walls? Isolate? Not necessarily, but in game theory terms, you must understand who benefits from your belief in them. Because in any system where rewards exist, social, emotional, financial, there will always be players who fake the rules to get ahead. The tragedy is not that trust can be broken. It's that by the time it breaks, it's already too late. The damage isn't just external. It seeps into your inner world. You begin to question your judgment, your memories, your value. And worst of all, you start to pull back from everyone else, punishing the innocent for what the skilled deceiver did. That's the true cost. Not just broken bonds, but broken openness. Because now, every smile feels suspicious. Every compliment feels loaded. Every act of kindness feels like a setup. And in that loneliness, in that hypervigilance, the players who win aren't the ones who play fair. They're the ones who taught you never to trust again. But don't worry, the game hasn't ended yet, because the next move comes quietly from those closest to you. The ones you never thought of as competitors. The ones who call themselves friends, even as they silently keep score. How friends compete secretly. Friendship is supposed to be the one place untouched by strategy, a refuge from rivalry. The people you choose not because they give you something, but because they understand you without conditions, without scorekeeping. But what if that's only half the truth? Game theory whispers something unsettling. Even friendships are arenas, subtle ones, but no less real, and the game being played isn't always visible. It doesn't wear the armor of open competition. It moves through jokes, comparisons, habits of tone, and most of all, timing. Think about the small moments. You get good news, a promotion, a new relationship, a sudden burst of clarity, and you tell your friend. They smile, say all the right things. But there's a delay, something behind their eyes, a half-second too long before they say, "I'm happy for you." You try to brush it off, but you feel it, the quiet friction, as if your joy is somehow a challenge they didn't expect. That's the thing about friendship. You share the stage. And even if no one says it out loud, there's often a subconscious comparison of whose life is winning right now, who's more fulfilled, who gets more attention, who's more admired in the shared social circle. Sometimes it's playful, a running joke about who's better at something. But underneath that joke, there's a current, a deep instinct to measure status, not against the world, but against the people closest to you. Game theorists call this positional competition. It's not about objective value, it's about relative rank. In a group of friends, everyone wants to be admired, needed, respected, but only a few can be the leader, the wise one, the most charming, the most successful, and so we subtly position ourselves to secure our roles. This might look like always being the one who gives advice, because advice implies authority, or being the one who makes the group laugh, because humor commands attention, or being the one who introduces new ideas, new music, new places, because novelty creates cultural leadership. But what happens when your friend starts doing what you're known for? The game begins. Not openly, not cruelly, but through micro moves, undercutting compliments, stories that center their wins after yours, gentle shifts of attention. And the trap is, you can't call it out without looking insecure. That's why this kind of competition is so dangerous. It hides behind the language of care, but it moves like chess. They post photos with other friends right after canceling plans with you. They don't respond to your exciting news, but instantly share their own. They dismiss your ideas in private, then repeat them in front of others as if they thought of them first. You start to wonder, are we still on the same side? Friendship becomes a delicate balancing act. You want to support them, but part of you doesn't want them to rise faster than you. Not because you're cruel, but because in this silent tournament of life progress, your place is relative to theirs. And if they leap ahead, what does that make you? This isn't a flaw in you. It's a system-level distortion. In a world obsessed with comparison, even friendships get infected, and it hurts because these are people you love, people you thought loved you back unconditionally. But in strategic systems, love doesn't erase hierarchy. It just makes it harder to see. So how do you protect yourself? By recognizing the game without playing it, by staying generous but observant, by noticing when you're shrinking yourself to make others comfortable or puffing yourself up to feel safe. True friendship doesn't demand symmetry, but it does require honesty. If you can't be celebrated without becoming a threat, you're not standing beside a friend, you're sitting across from a player. And the next time they say, "I'm so happy for you," listen, not just to the words, but to what isn't said. Because right after that moment, in the next breath, in the next silence, they may remind you exactly why trust in friendship is sometimes the most fragile game of all. And speaking of fragility, few games are more emotionally loaded than the one that begins when love demands a decision. Because when romance meets strategy, ultimatums step in, not as punishments, but as opening moves. Ultimatums in romantic love. Love is supposed to be the opposite of strategy. Messy, selfless, uncalculated. But what happens when it collides with pressure? When affection begins to resemble negotiation? That's when romance enters the game, and one of its sharpest weapons reveals itself. The ultimatum. Ultimatums are not always loud. They don't need slammed doors or shouted deadlines. Often, they arrive wrapped in soft words. I just need to know where this is going. If things don't change, I don't know if I can stay. I can't be the only one trying. Game theory shows us something uncomfortable here. An ultimatum at its core is a strategic move designed to limit the other player's options. It compresses freedom into a choice between two outcomes, one desirable, one painful, and it demands action under pressure. In relationships, this might sound like, commit to me or lose me. Change how you treat me or I'll walk away. Give me more or this ends. It presents itself as honesty, as transparency. But behind that, there's a maneuver, the power of credible threat. A threat becomes credible not when it's said, but when it's believed. And in love, belief is everything. Consider this, you and your partner are out of sync. Maybe they're non-committal. Maybe you're always the one initiating connection. You've brought it up before, but little changes. Then one day, you deliver the line. If you don't start making me a priority, I'll leave. Suddenly, their behavior shifts. They show up. They apologize. But is that love or compliance? Game theory warns us that once you issue an ultimatum, you change the structure of the game. You're no longer just two people navigating connection. You've introduced stakes, and stakes reshape everything. The partner now acts not just from feeling, but from risk management. Do I care enough to stay? Am I willing to lose them? Can I afford the cost of giving in? Here's the paradox. Ultimatums might get you what you want, but they also introduce suspicion. Is their choice sincere, or just a move to avoid loss? Romantic ultimatums walk a thin line between empowerment and control. On one hand, they clarify boundaries. On the other, they manufacture fear. That fear can become fuel for guilt, for obligation, for a lopsided relationship where one person always feels they're on probation. And when that happens, love becomes performance, not presence. Even subtler, some ultimatums are never spoken out loud, but they shape dynamics all the same. A partner knows that if they express a certain opinion, withdraw at the wrong time, or fail to meet expectations, they'll be met with coldness, distance, withdrawal of affection. This is emotional conditioning, and it turns intimacy into a high-stakes game of pleasing. Of course, not all ultimatums are manipulative. Sometimes they're necessary. When safety is compromised, when self-worth is eroded, when all other communication has failed. But even then, the question remains, is love still freely chosen, or is it negotiated through pressure? Because once you force someone to act by limiting their options, the dynamic has changed, maybe forever. Love thrives in vulnerability, in giving without leverage, in choosing someone when you could walk away, but choose not to. The moment it becomes about winning a concession, you're no longer dancing, you're playing chess. And the most dangerous part? The other person may give in, but silently begin to resent the rules of the game. Until one day, the board flips. Because no one likes being cornered, even by someone they once called home. And this brings us to the wider battlefield, where every interaction gets scored, where smiles, silence, and status updates function like pieces on a board. Because beyond romance, beyond close bonds, social approval is the ultimate arena. And most of us are playing it, whether we realize it or not. Social approval as a game board. We all play games, but some are played without boards, without rules we can see, and without the conscious realization that we're playing at all. One of the most complex and invisible of these games is the one centered around social approval. Think of it like this. In nearly every social setting, schools, workplaces, family dinners, online platforms, there's an unspoken scoreboard. Approval points are handed out for the right smile, the well-timed laugh, the acceptable opinion. We're not just being ourselves, we're being curated versions of ourselves, calculated for effect. Game theory tells us that whenever humans interact in groups, we form strategic behaviors to maximize reward and minimize rejection and social approval. That's one of the most valuable currencies we chase, because it buys us inclusion, safety, admiration, and sometimes even love. So we adapt. Not always consciously, but we adapt. You don't share the controversial opinion at lunch because it might create tension. You laugh at a joke you don't find funny because silence might make you seem cold. You post the filtered photo, not the real one, because honesty won't get the same engagement. These aren't just quirks of modern life, they're game moves. We're reading the room, estimating the cost of each word, each silence, each smile. Every choice becomes a calculation. This is known as reputation management, and it's deeply rooted in our evolutionary psychology. For most of history, being cast out from the group meant death. So we developed finely tuned radar for what pleases others, and survival became linked to fitting in. But here's where the trap tightens. When the game becomes about maintaining approval rather than expressing truth, we start to lose the boundary between performance and identity. Are you acting kind because you are kind, or because kindness earns you points? Are your beliefs really yours, or were they selected because they're socially safe? Even rebellion can be part of the game. The edgy opinion, the provocative statement, it can be a strategy to attract a different kind of approval, because deep down, we all want the same thing, to be seen, liked, and accepted, and we're willing to bend for it, sometimes, until we break. Social media amplifies this game into something relentless. Likes, retweets, views, comments. They're all visible signals of approval. And when those metrics guide our behavior, we become like players chasing rewards on a rigged board. But unlike chess or poker, this board is always shifting. What gets you approval today might cost you tomorrow. One misstep, a joke taken the wrong way, a silence interpreted as complicity, and the approval vanishes. This creates strategic anxiety, the fear that no matter how well you play, the goalposts will move. So we become cautious, guarded, less authentic, not because we're weak, but because we've learned the cost of being misread. The truth is, there is no way to win the social approval game long-term without losing pieces of yourself, because the rules are designed for flexibility, not authenticity. You begin to suppress the parts of you that are too intense, too weird, too painful, too honest. And over time, your personality becomes a highlight reel, crafted not to reflect who you are, but who you think others will approve of. It's exhausting, and yet most of us feel we have no choice. But here's the twist. People sense inauthenticity. Even if they don't say it, they feel it, which means playing for approval doesn't always guarantee it. Sometimes it does the opposite. It creates disconnection wrapped in politeness. Still, the game goes on because the risk of disapproval, of being excluded, dismissed, forgotten, is a primal fear. It's why we edit ourselves before speaking. It's why we rehearse texts before sending. It's why silence, in some situations, feels safer than truth. But sometimes, that silence becomes a strategy all its own, a weapon used not to please, but to vanish, to exit the board entirely, without confrontation. A tactic more painful than any argument, ghosting, and the game theory behind that is colder than you think. When ghosting is a strategy, it feels like a disappearance. One day, you're messaging, laughing, planning. The next, silence. No response, no explanation, just digital vanishing. And your mind spirals. Did I say something wrong? Are they okay? Was any of it real? Ghosting hurts because it mimics death, but without closure. But in the cold lens of game theory, ghosting is more than a cruel accident of modern dating. It's a strategic withdrawal. In a game where time, attention, and emotional investment are all resources, ghosting can be a calculated move to preserve one's own utility while avoiding conflict or cost. It's the non-confrontational exit, optimized for minimal energy and maximum ambiguity. We like to think communication is an exchange of truths, but often it's a negotiation of status and interest. And when the perceived value of the interaction dips, whether because of waning attraction, discomfort, or shifting options, some players choose to vanish rather than engage. Because engagement demands effort, empathy, and accountability. Ghosting, by contrast, requires none. But that doesn't make it neutral. Game theory recognizes strategic silence as a form of signaling. Silence, after connection, signals power. The ghost retains control. They set the terms by refusing further play. And this power imbalance, even if unintended, triggers the one left behind to seek resolution, which ironically grants the ghost more mental real estate, not less. This is a classic example of asymmetrical information. One player knows the game is over, the other does not. That imbalance leads the uninformed party to guess, hope, reanalyze, or double down, often to their own detriment. Why is ghosting so effective? Because it denies the opponent a move. You can't argue with silence. You can't negotiate with absence. You're left performing against a blank screen, and in that vacuum, your brain does the worst thing it can do. It fills in the gaps with self-blame. Now, not all ghosting is intentional malice. Some people withdraw from fear, anxiety, or confusion, but intent doesn't erase impact. In game terms, ghosting is a way of minimizing personal loss at another's emotional expense. It's a defensive play disguised as neutrality. Even more chilling, ghosting has evolved. It's not just an escape, it's now part of the strategy from the very beginning. In a world where matches come in the dozens, where communication is quick, casual, and disposable, people enter interactions already prepared to vanish. Ghosting becomes the default exit button. And here's the kicker: because ghosting is so common, it's no longer disqualifying. The ghost can return weeks later with a simple "hey," and many will respond, hoping to restart what never properly ended. This makes ghosting a risk-free tactic. One can disappear without consequence and reappear without penalty. In evolutionary terms, this is a survival move. In emotional terms, it's a hollowing one. Because every time someone ghosts you, you're taught to expect disappearance, to guard vulnerability, to anticipate vanishing. Which means, even when you do connect, you're half waiting for it to end. Ghosting reshapes the game board. It teaches people to play shorter, colder, and shallower, to exit preemptively, to ghost before being ghosted, and when everyone's playing to protect, connection becomes nearly impossible. We begin to confuse aloofness with strength, distance with desirability, silence with control. And so we train ourselves to respond less, to care slower, to match energy instead of lead with honesty. Because that's how you survive a board where love is just one more strategic resource to be spent or saved. But sometimes the game isn't even hidden anymore. Sometimes it's baked into the interface, a swiping battlefield full of options, vanish points, and delayed replies. And in that world, ghosting is just the opening move, because the real war starts on dating apps. The dating app war zone. It seems simple at first. You download the app, set up a profile, and start swiping. You tell yourself it's just modern dating, efficient, convenient. But beneath that surface lies a system built entirely on game theory. Every swipe, message, and profile isn't just a social interaction. It's a move on a game board you didn't realize you joined. The environment is designed to mimic a competitive market. You become a product. You start thinking in terms of presentation, optimization, performance. You select photos that make you look confident but approachable. You write bios that are just funny enough, just clever enough, just interesting enough to keep someone from swiping left. You're not being inauthentic, just strategic. And then, so is everyone else. You start noticing patterns, late replies, one-word responses, conversations that go nowhere. Ghosting after good chemistry. You assume it's personal, but it's often not. It's just that people are making trade-offs constantly, evaluating matches, comparing options, running subconscious cost-benefit calculations. Do I invest time here or keep swiping for something better? You're doing it too. This creates a space where attention is scarce, trust is thin, and every choice carries the shadow of another possible choice. It's what economists call a matching market with incomplete information. You can never really know what the other person is thinking or doing, so you rely on signals, response time, emoji use, profile tone, and those signals are deliberately vague. Meanwhile, algorithms reward the most liked profiles with more visibility. This creates a hierarchy, not based on connection or compatibility, but on engagement metrics. A small portion of users receive the majority of matches, while the rest are left cycling through rejections, second-guessing their worth. This uneven playing field leads to defensive strategies. People delay replies to appear busy. They ghost before things get too emotional. They stack matches and stagger conversations. You begin to recognize that much of this behavior isn't cruelty, it's risk management. No one wants to get hurt, so they stay detached, but that detachment spreads, and soon every interaction feels filtered through calculation instead of curiosity. What was supposed to make connection easier ends up making it more transactional. You're not meeting people, you're negotiating attention. Even your own behavior begins to shift. You downplay vulnerability, avoid depth, and craft personas that seem desirable rather than genuine. Not because you're shallow, but because the system punishes openness. If you show too much, too early, you risk being dismissed. So you retreat into safe banter, curated charm, and emotional ambiguity. And that's the core of the problem. These platforms nudge you toward emotional distance while selling the illusion of intimacy. It's not love you're chasing anymore. It's recognition, validation, a sense that you're still playing the game well enough to win. But at some point, you start to wonder, what if I stop playing? What if I show up honestly? What if I take the risk? That's where the real danger begins. Because in this game, vulnerability is a calculated risk, and the next move might cost more than you expect. Why vulnerability is a calculated risk? There's a reason why people hesitate before opening up. It's not just fear, it's strategy. Vulnerability, though romanticized in books and movies, is often treated like a gamble in real life. You reveal a truth, a weakness, a hope, and silently wait to see whether the other person leans in or backs away. In game theory, that's called a signaling move. And like any move in a strategic system, it comes with cost and consequence. When you're vulnerable, you're handing someone power. You're saying, here's something real about me. Do with it what you will. And that's dangerous in any system where people are optimizing for self-interest, status, or emotional safety. Vulnerability is an offer of trust in a world full of players who might not reciprocate or who might use that information to gain advantage. So people run quiet calculations. Will sharing this make them see me differently? Will it scare them off? Will it change the power balance? Every pause before a text, every hesitation before telling someone how you really feel, that's not just emotion, it's strategy. You're estimating risk based on prior feedback, cultural norms, and the behavior of the person you're talking to. In relationships, especially early ones, people often hold back. Not because they don't care, but because caring too soon, too openly, too visibly can be punished. There's an unspoken race to stay slightly less invested, to show less eagerness, to avoid being the one who feels more. Vulnerability, in this sense, becomes a liability. Even long-term relationships aren't immune. Many people construct emotional walls within partnerships to maintain leverage or avoid perceived weakness. If I tell them how much that hurt me, they'll know they got to me. Or if I act like I don't need them, maybe they'll value me more. The game doesn't stop when the relationship begins. It just changes rules. But this is where things get more complex. Vulnerability is also the only real way to build depth. When someone lets you see the parts of themselves they hide from the world, it creates intimacy that no amount of shared interests or witty banter can replace. That's why people crave it. It's also why people fear it, because the same truth that bonds can also backfire. Some people weaponize vulnerability, not in the obvious sense, but by extracting it from others without offering any in return. They prompt deep confessions while staying emotionally guarded. They encourage raw honesty, only to withdraw once it's shared. That imbalance creates emotional asymmetry. One person exposed, the other protected. Others treat vulnerability like currency, something to offer strategically when it benefits them, during arguments, reconciliations, or moments when they want to regain control. And when people sense that, they become even more cautious, even more skeptical. The irony is that most people want to be seen, understood, accepted. But because the social environment is structured like a game of poker, where showing your hand too soon can lead to loss, people end up bluffing their way through emotional connection. That leaves both sides unsure whether they're relating to a person or a performance. Still, vulnerability remains the only route out of this cycle. Not naive exposure, but intentional openness, the kind that says, I know this might change things, but I'd rather be honest than guarded. It's a high-risk, high-reward strategy. Sometimes it fails, sometimes it hurts. But when it lands, when someone meets your openness with their own, the game changes, the bluff ends, the real conversation begins. And yet, even in that shared honesty, another illusion can quietly take shape, the belief that things are now fair. That because you both opened up, the relationship will unfold with balance and equality. But fairness, too, can be a mirage. And that brings us to the next trap we rarely see coming. The fairness illusion in relationships. We grow up with an idea that fairness is a natural outcome in love, that if you care equally, try equally, give equally, then balance will follow. But relationships rarely run on perfect balance sheets. What looks fair from one side often feels unjust from the other, and yet both believe they're right. This illusion begins subtly. You remember the last time you compromised, the last time you apologized first, the last time you sacrificed something small for the other person. You keep mental tabs, not out of pettiness, but for reassurance. You want to believe you're not being taken advantage of, that you're both contributing in ways that matter. But the problem with tracking fairness is that it's filtered through ego, through emotion, through memory shaped by bias. You notice what you give far more than what you receive. You feel your own sacrifices more deeply than those made for you. So even when the relationship is relatively balanced, it can feel tilted. This creates a quiet resentment, a sense that you're always the one doing more, being more patient, making more effort. And because your partner likely feels the same, the illusion replicates on both sides. The fairness illusion also thrives in silence. People don't always articulate what they're giving. They assume it's visible, obvious, that it should be noticed without being pointed out. But what you view as meaningful, listening to their frustrations, tolerating their moods, giving them space, they might not even register. And what they see as their own effort might seem invisible to you. So you wait, hoping they'll do their part without being asked, that they'll reciprocate spontaneously, thoughtfully. But when they don't, frustration builds. You start thinking in terms of emotional debts. Who owes who? Who's falling behind? You may not say it out loud, but it shapes your tone, your energy, your decisions. And from the outside, the relationship still looks stable, but inside it's already trading on deficit. Then there's the trap of symmetrical conflict, the belief that fights should be fair, that if one person says something hurtful, the other is now entitled to retaliate, that anger justifies anger, withdrawal justifies withdrawal. Apology should follow apology. But real emotions don't work like courtroom evidence. Even if someone is technically right, the damage done doesn't always feel justified. Words land differently depending on history, on insecurity, on context. What's worse is that this illusion can turn people into quiet accountants of pain, each side tallying slights in generosity, withholding or overcompensating based on an invisible scorecard. And when both believe they're being unfairly treated, something breaks, not always loudly. Sometimes just in the subtle drop of affection, in the cooling of touch, in the unspoken decision to give less because giving didn't feel fair. Relationships that thrive aren't built on a perfect system of exchange. They're built on a tolerance for imbalance, a recognition that fairness isn't a moment-by-moment ledger, it's a feeling cultivated over time, one that requires grace, not precision. And the wisdom to understand that the effort you make when they don't notice is what makes the connection real. Still, in moments of tension, many revert to old strategies. They mimic tone, mirror behaviors, reflect anger with anger, coldness with silence. Because somewhere deep inside, we believe it will teach the other person a lesson. But more often, it just deepens the rift. That's the trap we often don't realize we've walked into, where reflecting someone's worst moment feels like the only way to be understood. The mirror strategy in conflict. This is the mirror strategy in conflict. It's not planned, it's not even verbalized, but it spreads through interactions like smoke. One partner goes cold, the other follows. One shows impatience, the other grows curt. On the surface, it looks like both are just reacting. But beneath that, something deeper is happening. Each person is trying to force the other to see what it feels like, to live it, to feel it. There's a quiet, unconscious habit most people fall into when they're hurt. They start reflecting, not on themselves, on the other person. on their tone, their posture, their silence. And then, almost without thinking, they mirror it. If they speak sharply, you reply sharply. If they withdraw, you grow distant. If they dismiss, you dismiss harder. It feels like defense, but in reality, it's a game, a psychological negotiation, a standoff in behavior. It's hard to recognize this while it's happening. After all, it doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like fairness. They distanced first. They yelled first. They rolled their eyes first. You're just responding in kind. That's how conflict often justifies itself, by pointing at what came before. But the truth is, the mirror strategy is rarely about fairness. It's about control. When you feel powerless to change the situation, you reach for the only tool left, imitation. Because instead of producing empathy, it usually triggers escalation. The person on the receiving end of the mirrored behavior doesn't think, now I understand how that made them feel. They think, why are you being like this? In that moment, your pain becomes their problem. Your message is lost inside the delivery, and the cycle tightens. You're not just being cold, you're trying to show them what their coldness feels like. You're not just avoiding them, you're trying to recreate the pain they caused by avoiding you. It's punishment through performance, and like most unspoken strategies, it tends to backfire. This is where the strategy becomes a trap. Each person thinks they're initiating a lesson, but really they're continuing a pattern. And with each mirrored response, the original hurt gets more buried, less clear, harder to name. The relationship begins to orbit the surface level, the tension, the tone, the timing, while the core truth, the vulnerable, this is what hurt goes unsaid. You want them to see. You want them to flinch, to pause, to realize. So you wear their behavior back to them like a mask they forgot they owned. And when that doesn't work, when it only hardens them, it feels like proof that they don't care, that they can't understand, that you're alone in this. But what if they were doing the same thing to you? What if the coldness you felt first was actually a mirror of your silence a week ago? Breaking this pattern requires doing the uncomfortable thing. Not mirroring, not retaliating, not performing their behavior back at them. It requires speaking from below it. That distance made me feel unwanted. That tone made me feel small. Not to accuse, but to reveal. Not to trap, but to open. And yet, the instinct to mirror goes far beyond conflict. It shows up in daily life, in tiny gestures, in fleeting conversations. Without even thinking, we copy others. Their expressions, their tone, their values, their fears, all because, somewhere deep in the architecture of being human, we are wired to reflect. Sometimes as connection, sometimes as camouflage, and sometimes without ever realizing it. Of course, that sounds simple, but in the heat of conflict, it can feel like surrender, like weakness, like letting them win. That's the illusion of the mirror strategy. It feels strong because it mimics power, but it only delays understanding. Why you imitate without realizing. Walk into a room of strangers and watch what your body does. It adjusts. Subtly, you might cross your arms because someone else did. Laugh a little louder because others are laughing. Even the way you stand, how you nod, how long you hold eye contact, it begins to align, like you're tuning yourself to the room without ever making a decision. And if someone were to ask, why are you doing that? You'd likely say, I'm just being myself. But the self is porous. We think of imitation as something children do, but adults do it constantly. Not just behaviorally, but mentally, emotionally, strategically. The moment you observe someone getting attention for speaking a certain way, your tone shifts. When you see someone being praised for being quiet, you speak less. In meetings, in friendships, in love, we echo, not out of weakness, but because mimicry is ancient, it's survival. In evolutionary terms, imitation had power. If someone in your tribe knew how to find food, build shelter, make allies, you watched and copied. If you didn't last. So your brain learned, mirror the successful, even if they didn't explain, even if they didn't know what they were doing either. That instinct never left. Now, it plays out in far stranger ways. You imitate not just the people you admire, but even those you despise, because attention alone confers influence. The influencer you hate watch on your feed. Your language might already echo theirs. The coworker who intimidates you. You might copy their habits just to feel safer. Imitation doesn't need approval. It only needs exposure. And the mirror goes deeper. It slips into emotional spaces. Around anxious people, you grow tense. Around confident ones, you feel braver. Around sarcastic ones, you grow sharper. Not because you want to be like them, but because part of your nervous system thinks this is how you belong here. This is the cost of entry. It's why groupthink is so powerful. Why trends catch fire. Why one person's panic can ripple through a calm crowd. We like to believe we think independently, act individually, feel uniquely. But the truth is, most of us are walking mosaics. Tiny fragments of people we've watched, loved, feared, admired, envied. We carry echoes we didn't choose and barely notice. This imitation isn't all bad. It can teach. It can connect. When done consciously, it can be empathy in motion. But when unnoticed, it blurs the line between who you are and who you're reacting to. That's when imitation becomes identity, and identity becomes reactive. This also explains why it feels so personal when someone doesn't imitate you, when your tone doesn't land, when your style isn't copied, when your opinion doesn't sway anyone. A small part of you feels erased, as if invisibility means irrelevance. Because we've been taught, however subtly, that to be imitated is to matter. But there's a darker edge to all this. Because if we're always mirroring, then some of our worst behaviors may not feel like ours at all. The way we lash out, withdraw, manipulate, blame, these too can be inherited, modeled, mirrored. That coldness you learned from a parent, that cruelty picked up in school, that passive aggression copied from a past partner. We repeat strategies we never intended to learn. And sometimes, imitation becomes the first move in a longer, more dangerous game. A cycle we don't recognize until we're already deep inside it, believing we're just protecting ourselves when we're actually setting the next move in motion. Tit for tat in everyday revenge. You probably don't think of yourself as someone who seeks revenge. The word sounds dramatic, reserved for novels or courtroom dramas, but revenge wears many outfits. It's in the cold tone of a text, the delayed reply, the compliment you didn't give, the favor you suddenly forgot to return. It hides in pauses, in silence, in tiny recalibrations of warmth. And often, you're not even aware you're doing it, but your brain is. Deep in our psychology lies a program as old as tribal firelight, tit for tat. You hurt me, I hurt you back. Not more, not less, just equal, just fair. It's baked into our sense of justice, but what's strange is how subtle it becomes in modern life. It doesn't show up with swords or shouts. It leaks into relationships like smoke. Your coworker doesn't credit your idea in a meeting. You nod, smile, then quietly withhold help next week. A friend cancels plans last minute. Again, you don't bring it up. But next time, you're just too busy. A partner makes a passive-aggressive comment. You respond with one of your own, but wrapped in charm. These aren't grand acts of vengeance. They're micro-reprisals. Silent scores being settled. You wouldn't call it revenge, but the emotional algorithm running beneath your actions would. Because tit for tat is a strategy. In game theory, it's remarkably effective. It keeps players honest, cooperative, but it only works when both parties recognize the system, when there's transparency, when the cost and consequence are visible. In real life, most of the time, the other person doesn't even know they're being punished, so they retaliate without knowing why. And the loop begins. That's the trap. It feels satisfying. For a second, the small act of withdrawal. The internal that'll show them. But the damage is rarely proportional and never surgical. Because most of the time, your target isn't actually a villain. They're distracted, thoughtless, misunderstood. Or maybe you are. But now, with tit-for-tat activated, both sides believe they're simply responding. No one thinks they started it. And if that sounds like war logic, it is. At the heart of all grudges lies a quiet scoreboard, a running tally. They said this, so I said that. They did this, so I backed off. But here's the twist. We often keep score differently than others. What feels like a light jab to you might land like a betrayal to someone else. What you think of as justice, they feel as cruelty. This is why so many relationships crumble without ever exploding. It's not the fights. It's the little retaliations that accumulate, the smiles that disappear, the warmth that fades, the things left unsaid on purpose. And here's the irony. We think tit for tat protects us, makes us strong, teaches them a lesson. But often, it does the opposite. It turns you into someone who adapts to other people's flaws, who reflects their worst moments, who lets their missteps write your next move. That's not power. That's puppetry. You don't need to accept every insult, but ask yourself, is this response a boundary or a disguised revenge? Am I being clear or just clever at withholding? Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it smiles, nods, pretends nothing happened, then quietly writes someone off. But before you play the next move, consider this. Retaliation often isn't communication. It's camouflage. It lets you avoid the real conversation. The vulnerable one. The one where you ask, did you mean to hurt me? The one where you explain instead of mirror. And the longer you wait, the harder that conversation becomes. The easier it is to keep playing the silent game. A game that promises fairness, but often ends in loss. Punishing others hurts you more. There's something deeply instinctual about the desire to punish. Someone wrongs you, and even before logic kicks in, the emotional machinery has already started drafting retribution. Not necessarily out of cruelty, but from a primal sense of fairness. You want them to feel what you felt. You want to balance the scales. But here's where it turns. The moment you act on that desire, the wound doesn't close, it deepens. Not for them. For you. Game theory and behavioral economics have explored this at length. In experiments where participants were allowed to spend their own money to punish unfair behavior, even when they gained nothing, they often chose to do so. It's called altruistic punishment. You harm yourself just to ensure someone else suffers a little too. Because deep down we believe the system only works if injustice carries a cost. But there's a hidden fee no one tells you about. That emotional satisfaction of punishment. It's fleeting, a spark in the dark. But the bitterness you had to conjure to strike back, that stays. It starts to thread itself into how you think, how you react, how you trust. And now, you're not just someone who was hurt. You're someone who's actively hurting back. Even subtly, even justifiably, and every act of retaliation, no matter how small, reinforces the very pain you wanted to purge. You begin to orbit around the wrong that was done to you, replaying it, re-justifying your response, rebuilding a self-image as someone who stands up for themselves, while unknowingly giving the offender even more control. Because as long as your behavior is shaped by their betrayal, they still have power. You're not responding from your values, you're reacting to their failure. And that's the cost. What begins as justice can morph into obsession. The satisfaction fades, but the resentment lingers. Like carrying a hot coal with the intention of throwing it, you're the one who gets burned the longest. It doesn't mean you shouldn't stand up for yourself, but ask, is this about healing or about proving a point? Is it resolution you're after or revenge in disguise? Because true strength often looks like stepping away. Not because they deserve grace, but because you do. Letting go isn't weakness. It's reclaiming your time, your peace, your emotional clarity. It's refusing to let someone else's failure define your emotional climate. Sometimes the deepest form of punishment is indifference. Not because you're cold, but because you're done letting them take up space in your mind, in your heart, in your story. When you no longer respond from pain, they no longer have a part in your play. They become background noise. And here's where the paradox unfolds. When you punish others, you often prolong your own pain. But when you resist that pull, when you lead with integrity rather than vengeance, you reclaim something far more valuable than a temporary moral high. You reclaim yourself. Of course, that doesn't mean letting people walk over you. It means refusing to become like them in the process of holding them accountable. Because the greatest punishment isn't an insult or a cold shoulder. It's rising above the script they expect you to follow. And every time you choose to do that, to respond rather than react, you shrink their impact. You stop playing the game they started. Which brings us to an unexpected counter-strategy. One that sounds almost naive, but in truth, it's one of the most powerful moves in any social interaction. The power of making the first move. In most games, the player who moves first sets the tone. In life, it's the same. Making the first move, whether in conversation, negotiation, or confrontation, grants you an invisible edge. It frames the situation on your terms, defines what's normal, and subtly forces others to respond within the structure you created. That's not just a guess. It's a principle in game theory called first mover advantage. Whoever acts first gets to shape the playing field. But outside of academic definitions, it shows up in ways most people overlook. Being the first to apologize, the first to propose, the first to say hello in an awkward silence, the first to offer value in a new relationship. These moments might seem small, but they ripple outward in powerful ways. When you make the first move, you seize narrative control. You're not reacting, you're initiating. And initiators are perceived as confident, capable, and even dominant traits we instinctively associate with leadership and trust. The person who acts first seems to know something others don't, even when they're just taking a leap. But there's more to it than confidence. It's also a psychological trapdoor. People tend to anchor their judgments based on the first offer, the first statement, the first behavior. In business, if you open with a price, that number becomes the benchmark, even if it's arbitrary. In dating, the person who opens with warmth often determines the emotional climate of the interaction. In conflict, the first person to speak calmly after an outburst often softens the tone of the entire argument. It's not manipulation, it's leadership. And yet most people wait. They wait for signs, signals, guarantees. They wait until they feel sure. But by the time they do, the opportunity has already shrunk or passed entirely. They forget that the risk of going first is often smaller than the risk of waiting too long. The hesitation usually comes from fear of rejection, of being seen as too eager, too vulnerable, too exposed. But if you study the patterns, you'll find something odd. The first mover often gains admiration, even if the move doesn't succeed. Because what people remember isn't always the result, it's the courage it took to act. There's also a tactical reason to move first. In uncertain situations, people look to others to model behavior. This is called social proof. When no one's sure what to do, the first person to act creates a kind of gravity. They become the unspoken example. If you stand up in a quiet room, others feel that shift. If you speak up when something's wrong, others feel permission to follow. And if you're silent, they stay silent too. But here's the catch. Moving first doesn't mean always giving first. It doesn't mean being reckless or endlessly generous. Timing and intention matter. You move first, not just to act, but to test, to reveal, to explore who responds and how. It's not about being aggressive. It's about showing the world that you're willing to step into discomfort for the sake of clarity, growth, or peace. That you'd rather shape a moment than be shaped by it. Because when you hesitate, someone else will act. And when they do, you've surrendered the frame. So next time you're on the edge of a decision, ask yourself, are you waiting out of wisdom or fear? Are you hoping someone else will go first so you don't have to be the one who risks? Or can you become the person who sets things in motion? Because the move you don't make, the first message, the first boundary, the first offer of help, might be the one that changes everything. And ironically, the longer you delay to avoid risk, the more vulnerable you become. But what happens when the move you make is too much? When giving becomes your default tactic, not your strategy. What begins as strength can quietly slip into weakness, especially when the generosity you offer isn't returned. Giving too much is strategic failure. It sounds noble, selfless, generous. Give without expecting anything in return, and the world will reward your goodness, or so we're taught. But beneath the poetry of unconditional giving lies a brutal game theory truth. When you give too much, too easily, too often, you lose leverage. And in games of survival, status, or connection, that loss can be fatal. Strategic generosity is powerful. It builds goodwill, earns trust, and opens doors. But when giving becomes habitual, automatic, unreciprocated, or driven by a need to be liked, it becomes a signal of weakness. It tells others you're not keeping score, that you'll tolerate imbalance, that your needs don't matter as much as theirs. And here's the uncomfortable part. People notice. Even if they don't say it, even if they appreciate the gesture, the human mind is wired to detect advantage. When someone keeps offering value without asking for anything back, we subconsciously file it away. They're pliable. They're available. They won't push back. Eventually, giving too much reshapes your relationships. What once felt generous becomes expected. The favors stop feeling like gifts and start feeling like obligations on your end. And soon you're not connecting. You're performing a role. It's not just social. In negotiation theory, there's a principle called the concession trap. The more you give without resistance, the less each gift is worth. Each new offer becomes the baseline for the next one. That first discount, taken for granted. That extra help, expected next time. Your effort no longer earns respect. It resets expectations. This isn't about becoming selfish. It's about being aware. Because when you give too much without clarity or boundaries, you stop being strategic and start becoming invisible. You dissolve into the background of others' lives, useful only when needed, forgotten when not. You may think, but I'm just being kind. I want to help. That's valid. But even kindness needs structure. Even empathy needs self-preservation. Because if you drain yourself to fill others, what's left of you? The deeper danger is identity erosion. You become known for your usefulness, not your uniqueness. You become valuable for what you provide, not who you are. And if what you provide ever runs out, your time, energy, money, support, so does the relationship. Real strategy is reciprocal. It watches the balance. It adjusts. It knows when to step forward and when to hold. Strategic generosity is not endless giving. It's calibrated offering. It says, I will give, but I will not disappear. It's a form of self-respect. And strangely, it invites more respect from others too. When you set limits, people listen more carefully. When you say no, your yes gains weight. When you withdraw from one-sided dynamics, you stop enabling the very behavior that drains you. But many avoid this shift because giving, especially for people-pleasers, feels safe. It buys approval. It silences conflict. It protects against rejection. But this safety is an illusion. Long-term, overgiving breeds resentment, quiet regret, and emotional exhaustion. The most dangerous part? You may not even realize it's happening. You just feel tired, taken for granted, less visible in your own life. And somewhere beneath the surface, the person who once gave freely now wonders, what would happen if I stopped? And that's a powerful question, because if the giving is the glue, then withholding it reveals the true shape of your relationships. who stays when you stop performing, who values you when you're not convenient. That's not bitterness. That's clarity. Because in every interaction, visible or not, a strategy is unfolding. And sometimes protecting your value isn't about doing more. It's about doing less with intention. And yet, so many still struggle to pull back. They hesitate to ask for what they truly want. Not because they don't know, but because something deeper holds them back. Why you hide what you want? You've done it. Everyone has. A quiet hesitation before admitting what you really want. A softened version of the truth. A half smile, a shrug, a deflection. You downplay it. You pretend it's not that important. Sometimes you convince even yourself that it isn't. But it is, and in that moment, you've entered a deeply strategic territory of game theory, one where concealment becomes survival and honesty becomes risk. Hiding what you want isn't always deception. It's often a reaction. Because wanting is exposure. It reveals your desires, your hopes, your pressure points. To want something is to show your vulnerability. And in games where people are calculating moves, whether consciously or not, vulnerability can be a weapon. So we shield it. We hide our true preferences in negotiations so we don't lose leverage. We mask our emotional needs in relationships to avoid seeming needy. We pretend indifference in competitive environments because caring too much feels like giving power away. This isn't irrational. It's adaptive. Game theorists call this information asymmetry. The less others know about your true preferences, the more control you retain. If they can't see what matters most to you, they can't pressure, manipulate, or use it against you. You preserve optionality. But that strategy comes at a cost. When you hide what you want too well, too often, you lose clarity, not just in your relationships, but in yourself. The line between privacy and repression blurs. And suddenly, your life starts to move in directions you didn't choose, because no one, including you, truly knew what mattered. It shows up subtly. You feel unseen, even when surrounded, misunderstood, even when you've spoken, disappointed, even when you got what you asked for. That's the hidden tax of concealment. And others pay it too. People around you operate based on signals. If you never show them what you value, they'll either guess wrong or stop trying to guess at all. Resentments quietly build, not because people don't care, but because you never gave them the chance to understand. There's a paradox here. The more you hide what you want to protect yourself, the more isolated you become. And the more isolated you become, the less likely your true desires are to be met. Why do we do this? Sometimes it's fear of rejection. If you admit what you want and don't get it, the hurt feels sharper, so you stay vague. That way, disappointment can wear the mask of ambivalence. Other times, it's shame. We judge our own desires, label them as selfish, naive, unrealistic, and so we bury them. Or we've been told what we should want for so long that we doubt our real cravings when they surface. And then there's power. In certain games, concealment is the power. Mystery holds value. Desire kept in shadow draws curiosity. Ambiguity is control. But is that control worth the consequences? Because when we silence our wants for too long, they don't disappear. They resurface, often sideways, in bitterness, in passive aggression, in strange compromises, in hollow victories. And if the people around you are playing different games, ones where honesty leads to trust or clarity builds connection, your strategy starts working against you. You'll feel further away from the outcomes you secretly crave. That's when hiding becomes a trap. Reclaiming what you want takes courage. Not the loud, dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that says, "This matters to me," even when your voice shakes. It's not always about announcing your desires to the world. Sometimes it's just about not editing yourself when you look in the mirror. Because if you don't name what you want, how can you ever move toward it? But even naming it doesn't guarantee peace, because once it's visible, it can be used, it can be blocked, or mocked, or twisted into a decoy. And that's exactly what comes next. How you're used as a decoy. You probably don't even realize when it happens. You're being charming at the party, smiling through a joke you didn't quite catch. You're answering a question in a meeting, giving your best guess while someone else watches how it lands. You're asked to speak first, to go first, to post first, while others silently take notes. That's the quiet role of a decoy. In game theory, decoys aren't just pawns, they're strategic tools, placed intentionally, sometimes unknowingly, to draw attention, absorb risk, or make someone else look better by comparison. And in real life, you're more familiar with this than you think. Think about social settings where stakes are high, job interviews, competitive teams, romantic circles, friend groups where everyone secretly keeps score. In these games, being the first to speak can expose your thinking. Being the one to take the lead can show your hand. Being too visible invites comparison, criticism, or mimicry. So, many people wait, watch, and use. They let someone else take the hit, someone else to say the hard thing, someone else to voice the unpopular idea, someone else to walk into the fire of feedback so they can follow with polished precision. And often, that someone else is the one who's trying hardest. The enthusiastic, the generous, the open, they become the decoy. This isn't always malicious, it's often subconscious. People default to roles without realizing the dynamics they're reinforcing. But whether intentional or not, the effect is the same. Your visibility becomes someone else's safety net. Your effort becomes their data. Your vulnerability becomes their strategy. The decoy absorbs risk so others don't have to. In politics, we see decoy candidates split the vote. In marketing, decoy pricing options steer you toward a preferred choice. In nature, decoy organisms are used to protect the real target. And in human interaction, decoy behavior shifts attention, sometimes to shield someone else, sometimes to sacrifice you. You've been the decoy in group chats, where your opinion softened the tension, in brainstorming sessions where your half-formed idea sparked someone else's polished pitch, in friendships where your chaos made theirs look composed. It's a strange kind of spotlight, bright, but not flattering. And once you start seeing it, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The same people defer. The same people praise your bravery after the fact. The same people stay clean while you get messy. That's not partnership. That's positioning. What makes this role even more seductive is that it can feel like leadership. You're speaking first, doing more, taking initiative. It feels noble, productive, valued. But not all value leads to power, and not all spotlight leads to control. Being a decoy often means being visible, but replaceable, central, but not protected, respected, but not defended. So why do we let ourselves be used? Part of it is conditioning. We're taught to contribute, to participate, to go first. We reward early adopters, bold speakers, eager volunteers, but we rarely teach when to hold back, when to observe, when not to be the experiment others learn from. Another part is fear. If we don't step up, will we be forgotten, overlooked, passed by? So we act, we share, we reveal. And sometimes the person watching us the closest is the one who will benefit most. There's nothing wrong with being bold, but boldness without strategy becomes sacrifice. You don't need to hide, but you do need to know the game you're in. Who gains when you speak first? Who copies your moves? Who rides the wave after you crash into the shore? It's not about paranoia, it's about pattern recognition. Because sometimes what looks like praise is just a thank you for absorbing the blow. And what looks like partnership is just a polite form of positioning. You deserve more than to be someone else's test balloon. So pause before you go first. Ask yourself, am I being brave or am I being placed? And if the answer unsettles you, you're not alone. Because the next move, choosing whether to sacrifice or stand back, might just determine how long you survive the game. Sacrificing to survive the game. You've been told that sacrifice is noble, that giving up something now secures something better later, that compromise keeps things moving, keeps people happy, keeps you in the room. But in game theory, and in life, sacrifice often isn't about noble ideals. It's a tactic, a quiet maneuver to stay on the board, even if it means losing a few pieces of yourself along the way. In zero-sum games, someone must lose for another to win. But in complex social games, the ones we play daily, there's a subtler logic. Sometimes you give up power not to be generous, but to avoid becoming a threat. Sometimes you downplay success so you're not targeted. You stay quiet so you're not labeled difficult. You say yes to things that drain you just to maintain an alliance. That's sacrifice not as virtue, but as survival. You've seen it in office dynamics, the colleague who works overtime without credit to seem indispensable. In family systems, the child who becomes the peacemaker to stop the yelling. In friendships, the person who absorbs insults disguised as jokes just to avoid the awkward silence that would follow if they said it wasn't funny. These sacrifices aren't grand or dramatic. They're small, repeated acts of self-erasure. The kind you justify by saying it's not a big deal, even though it accumulates like sediment in your soul. Because in games of social strategy, there's often an unspoken pressure to bleed just enough to prove you belong. You give up time, comfort, opinions, boundaries, so that others stay calm, so that the group doesn't splinter, so that you're not left out, and over time, this becomes your identity. The person who can handle it. The person who says yes, the person who doesn't need much. But there's a cost. Sacrifices done in silence often go unnoticed. Worse, they become expected. What began as generosity is now your baseline. What felt like resilience is now interpreted as compliance. People stop asking if you're okay because you've trained them not to. And yet, you keep playing because the alternative seems worse. If you don't give, will they turn on you? Replace you? Will you be seen as selfish, disloyal, fragile? So you continue, hoping that loyalty will be rewarded. That being useful will translate into being valued. That sacrifice will eventually make you safe. But here's the paradox. In many strategic environments, the more you sacrifice, the more you signal weakness. Not because you are weak, but because you've taught others that you will trade your needs for their comfort. You become a predictable player, an easy mark. And predictable players lose. Game theory doesn't reward kindness for its own sake. It rewards outcomes. And in some games, survival means showing that you can't be pushed indefinitely. That you know when to walk away. That you see the board, not just the emotion in the moment. So, how do you unlearn a survival strategy that's built on giving parts of yourself away? You start by seeing it. You notice the tiny moments when your body tenses before saying yes, when your voice shrinks to keep peace, when you catch yourself smiling while someone walks all over you. And then you start practicing a new move. Delay, not refusal, just a pause, a space to ask, what do I lose by saying yes here? And who benefits if I do? That question alone reshapes the game. Because you're not just surviving anymore, you're becoming aware of the rules, the patterns, the cost. And once you see the cost, it's harder to pay it blindly. But there's a catch. Not everyone will like the shift. When a self-sacrificer stops playing their role, others often feel betrayed. Unspoken contracts are broken. The dynamic tilts. That's when you learn who actually cared, and who only cared that you were convenient. You may lose people, but you gain yourself. And that's a trade that in the long game might be the only way to truly win. Still, walking away from sacrifice doesn't free you from the game. Because once you stop giving, the next challenge begins. What happens when you try to opt out, only to realize the game continues whether you play or not? You can't opt out without losing. Imagine life as a vast board game where every move matters, even the ones you choose not to make. You might think stepping away means freedom, that refusing to play shields you from the consequences, but in reality, opting out doesn't remove you from the game. It just forfeits your influence over how it's played. In game theory, refusing to participate is a strategy, but it's not a neutral one. It's a move with consequences, often costly ones. Because when others keep playing, they start positioning around your absence. Your silence becomes an empty square on the board, a space others quickly fill. In everyday life, this shows up when you disengage from workplace politics and find yourself excluded from decisions that affect you. When you stop responding in a tense relationship, hoping peace will emerge from your withdrawal, but it only deepens the divide. When you ignore a conflict, believing it will resolve itself, only to watch it metastasize in your absence. Opting out can feel like self-protection, and sometimes it is. But over time, it can also become surrender disguised as peace. You don't vote in a flawed system, thinking your silence is a protest. But policy still changes, and not in your favor. You ghost a friend after betrayal, thinking the relationship will fade quietly. But they control the story of what happened. You keep your ambitions secret in a competitive environment, hoping humility speaks for itself. But others speak louder, and their voices define the field. Refusal to play doesn't pause the game. It simply writes you out of the next moves. Even choosing neutrality is seen as a position. In social dynamics, there is no off switch. You're judged by your silences, your hesitations, your exits, and the world is quick to fill in the blanks. Why? Because humans are story-driven. When you don't narrate your role, others do it for you. When you step out, they reshape the board without you in mind. And when you return, it's no longer your board. In negotiation theory, there's a concept called BAT-NAY, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Walking away works only when your alternative is strong, but most of us step back without a plan, hoping absence itself will teach others our worth. That's a gamble rarely won, because once you're gone, people adjust. They learn how to function without you. They cover your tasks, fill your silence, reassign your value, not with malice, but with momentum. Life moves fast. Games shift quickly. And that's the hardest part. Realizing that absence doesn't preserve your position, it erases it. So, what's the answer? Never stop playing? Always engage? Not exactly. It's about knowing when to retreat without disappearing, when to delay without ghosting, when to hold a boundary that still allows visibility. You don't have to play every game, but you do have to know which ones matter and what's at stake if you don't show up. Because opting out only works when you're still seen, still heard, still part of the calculation. Otherwise, you become the piece that fell off the table. But here's the twist. Once you accept that the game goes on, you also begin to notice the subtle moves others make, the things they don't say, the gaps they leave intentionally, the silences that aren't empty, but charged. Because silence, too, can be a strategy. And when used deliberately, it doesn't remove you from the game. It changes how the game plays you. How silence becomes control. In a world saturated with noise, constant notifications, arguments, opinions, status updates, silence is rarely neutral. It isn't just the absence of speech. It's a calculated move, and in many games, it's the most powerful one. We often imagine control as loud, someone barking orders, dominating conversations, taking up space. But true control, the kind that shifts dynamics without detection, often enters through silence. Not just what is withheld, but when, how, and why. A pause in conversation creates discomfort. That pause can pressure the other person to fill the gap, reveal more than intended, or even concede. A refusal to respond to a text doesn't feel passive. It feels sharp, deliberate, unsettling. The silence says more than 1,000 words could. This is how silence becomes a weapon. In game theory, it's the strategic non-move, a form of play where uncertainty becomes leverage. When someone doesn't react, doesn't reply, doesn't engage, they force the other side to speculate. And speculation breeds instability. You begin negotiating against phantoms, imagining intentions, filling in motives, second-guessing yourself. Consider the silent treatment. It's framed as emotional distance, but it's really an act of dominance. It shifts the burden to the other party, forces them to beg, to apologize, to repair something they may not have broken. Silence here isn't withdrawal. It's pressure, a quiet grip on the throat of the conversation. In politics and negotiations, silence can collapse deals or win them. The side that speaks less often gains more, because the other side reveals their desperation, their boundaries, their insecurities, simply by trying to end the silence. They give too much away trying to fill the void. In romantic relationships, silence can feel like abandonment, but sometimes it's punishment. One person pulls away not to process, but to control the rhythm of the relationship, to destabilize, to make the other person chase. Silence as seduction, silence as strategy. Even socially, silence creates illusions. You assume the quiet person is mysterious, wise, aloof, superior, or dangerous, because we fear what we can't read. And silence is a blank canvas where every fear paints itself. This applies inward too. The silences we keep within, truths we never voice, feelings we don't express, those aren't just shields. They become forms of internal control. If you never say what you want, no one can deny you. If you never reveal what hurts you, no one can hurt you more. So silence becomes your armor, your script, your illusion of safety. But it costs. It keeps others guessing, and sometimes guessing wrong. They assume you're indifferent when you're really aching. They assume you're strong when you're really drowning. Silence makes you powerful, but also invisible. And that's the paradox. Silence gives you control, but only by giving up your voice. You shape perception, yes, but not truth. You steer emotion, yes, but not understanding. Still, in many social games, silence is the smartest move you'll never be credited for. It's how you unsettle, delay, redirect. It's how you hold the floor without standing on it. Because not reacting can be more destabilizing than any reaction. It lets people wonder. And wondering, especially in human dynamics, is often worse than knowing. But once people begin responding to your silence more than your words, once they interpret your pauses more than your sentences, you've shifted the power balance. You're no longer playing by their rhythm. You've set your own. And now they're trying to sync with it without even realizing how much they're giving just to keep up. Of course, silence doesn't always remain silent for long, because the moment someone finally breaks it, offering a gift, a favor, an apology, it starts a cycle that can be harder to escape than silence itself. The infinite loop of reciprocity. Every culture teaches it. Every child learns it. Do unto others. Give back what you receive. Repay kindness. Don't leave debts hanging. Reciprocity is one of the oldest social currencies and one of the most quietly powerful strategies in game theory. On the surface, it feels pure. Someone gives you a favor. You give one in return. Someone listens to you. You listen back. Reciprocity makes the world feel fair, predictable, and even moral. But behind this simple principle hides a loop so deep and so embedded that most people never notice how often it's being used to shape them. It starts small. A free sample at the store, a compliment from a stranger, an unsolicited favor. These seem harmless, pleasant, even, but they're often designed to trigger the reciprocity reflex, that hardwired discomfort that says, I owe something now. And that discomfort can be exploited. Salespeople know this. So do politicians, influencers, even cult leaders. Do something for someone first, unexpectedly, and it opens a door. The person now feels socially compelled to give something back. Time, attention, trust. money. Not because they want to, but because the alternative, walking away with a perceived debt, feels worse. This works in reverse, too. When you say no to someone's request, they often reframe it as "after all I've done for you," as if all favors are investments waiting for a return, as if the balance sheet of human interaction must always be equal. And here's where the loop begins to distort. In theory, reciprocity keeps relationships stable, but in practice, it's rarely even. Some people give more than they get, and others learn how to take just enough to keep the cycle going. You end up chasing a balance that was never balanced to begin with. You offer more, hoping to match what was given or to keep what you have. Slowly, reciprocity stops feeling fair. It starts feeling like quiet pressure, a transaction wrapped in warmth. This is especially visible in long-term dynamics. Family, friendships, partnerships. Acts of care become obligations. Birthdays remembered. Calls returned. Emotional support given out of duty, not desire. Not because it's wrong to give, but because the expectation of giving never ends. The loop becomes an unspoken contract. I'll keep supporting you as long as you keep supporting me. And suddenly, you're not acting out of love. You're just fulfilling your end of a deal that was never written, but always implied. Even kindness can become currency. When you help someone out of genuine compassion, you expect nothing, but if they never reciprocate, never offer that same energy, you notice, you feel it. And over time, that absence erodes the relationship, not because you were keeping score, but because they weren't even playing the same game. Game theory calls this tit for tat. You match behavior. If someone cooperates, you cooperate. If they defect, you defect. It's a powerful strategy, but also a trap, because it conditions you to behave based on others, not on your own values. You stop asking, "What do I want to do?" and start asking, "What did they do first?" Reciprocity, when pure, is beautiful. But when it becomes expectation, manipulation, or a tool to control, it creates an endless cycle of keeping accounts. You can't just give without wondering what you'll get. You can't just receive without feeling the weight of owing. And the more this pattern solidifies, the more your decisions become entangled in invisible obligations. You begin to question motives. Was that kindness real, or just a move in the game? But in long-term dynamics, where this loop truly unfolds, another concept becomes far more important than immediate balance. A deeper form of strategy begins to emerge. One that isn't about returning favors at all. It's about building something much more durable. Trust as a long-term strategy. If you're playing a game that never ends, you don't just need a good move, you need a good reputation. That's the foundation of long-term strategy. And in a world shaped by game theory, trust isn't just a virtue, it's leverage, it's foresight. It's the quiet strategy that makes your future smoother, more stable, and far more powerful. In one-shot games, interactions that happen once and never again, betrayal can be profitable. There's no penalty for cheating if there's no tomorrow. But life isn't made of one-shot games. It's made of repeated ones. Conversations that echo, relationships that evolve, markets that remember. In these long-term games, trust becomes more valuable than any short-term win. Game theorists call this the shadow of the future. The idea that what you do today will affect how others treat you tomorrow, and that shadow changes everything. If people believe you're honest, they'll collaborate. If they know you keep your word, they'll depend on you. If they see you handle conflict with integrity, they'll include you in more games. That's the compounding power of trust. But building trust isn't instant. It's costly. It often requires passing up opportunities for quick gains. It means not taking advantage of someone even when you could. It means playing fair when no one's watching. Because in long games, your reputation is always being written, even in silence. There's a reason why trusted brands charge more, why trustworthy leaders are followed more loyally, why dependable friends are irreplaceable. Trust reduces friction. It makes coordination smoother, decisions faster, relationships deeper. It's the invisible oil that lets systems run without grinding into paranoia and suspicion. And here's the strange part. The most effective trust-building moves often feel irrational in the short term, like helping a rival, admitting fault, sharing information freely, letting others take credit. These look weak in the moment, but in the long run, they signal something rare: stability, that you're not reactive, that you don't panic, that you play a different game, and others adjust their strategies around you accordingly. But trust doesn't just grow. It can decay. One betrayal, even small, can unravel years of consistency. That's the danger of games played with hidden intentions. When you exploit trust to win once, you lose the ability to play again. People remember. And once suspicion sets in, everything becomes slower, colder, more transactional. Trust rewires incentives. When people trust you, they don't waste energy double-checking. They open up. They collaborate. They show you more of who they are. That feedback loop strengthens your position, not because you control them, but because you've created a space where strategic alignment becomes easier than manipulation. So why do people still betray? Because not everyone plays the long game. Some just want to win today, and others pretend they're playing long while quietly cashing in your trust. They know how trust works. They just don't believe in it. That's the most dangerous type of opponent, the one who uses the language of loyalty, vulnerability, and shared vision, but never intended to stay for the whole game. They use trust like a bridge they plan to burn right after they've crossed it. And that's when trust, as powerful as it is, becomes your greatest exposure, because it wasn't trust that failed, it was who you gave it to. Exploitation masquerading as loyalty. Loyalty is supposed to be noble, a sign of depth, of commitment, of unwavering support. We tell stories about it. We romanticize it. We reward it. But that's what makes it such a perfect mask for something else entirely: exploitation. In long-term strategy games, loyalty is currency. If you can convince someone you're loyal, they'll give you access, trust, resources, secrets, power. But real loyalty, mutual, earned, evolving, is rare. What's far more common is a one-sided loyalty, sculpted for control. And most of the time, the one being exploited doesn't even realize it. That's because the exploit doesn't come through open demands. It's embedded in subtle patterns. A friend who always asks for favors but is never available when you need one. A boss who praises your dedication but keeps loading your plate with work you never signed up for. A partner who insists your silence proves devotion, even when it's costing you everything. It works because the framing is powerful. If you push back, you're accused of being disloyal. If you hesitate, you're labeled selfish. The deeper your identity is tied to being the loyal one, the harder it becomes to see the game for what it is. Game theory has a name for this kind of trap: asymmetric games. One player bears the cost, while another reaps the reward. But in exploitation disguised as loyalty, the imbalance is hidden under social scripts, scripts that punish defection even when the arrangement has already gone rotten. This happens in families, in workplaces, in politics, and especially in relationships that claim to be built on love or sacrifice. You're reminded of everything they've done for you. You're guilted into staying. You're told that questioning anything is betrayal. But real loyalty includes reciprocity. It doesn't demand silence. It doesn't fear transparency. It holds up under inspection because it wasn't built on fear or obligation. It was built on shared values and mutual risk. That's how you tell the difference. If someone weaponizes the word loyalty to shield themselves from criticism, they're not asking for loyalty, they're asking for obedience. If they treat your questions as threats, they were never building with you, they were building on top of you. And yet, walking away from a loyalty you once believed in can feel like treason. That's the final trick. The game rewards the exploiter twice, once when they take from you, and again when you blame yourself for stopping them. So what do? You begin by paying attention to patterns, not promises. Real loyalty doesn't need constant defending. It shows up in behavior, in balance, in how people treat you when you stop being useful. Because once you see how often manipulation wears the costume of commitment, you start to ask deeper questions about every bond you've ever called loyalty. And when you do, you'll start to notice something else. How every group you've been part of seems to follow rules no one ever said out loud. Rules that shape your choices before you even know you've made one. The invisible rules of every group. Walk into any room, a workplace, a classroom, a friend circle, even a family dinner, and something strange happens. Before anyone speaks, before any rules are written or expectations are announced, your brain starts adjusting. Your posture, your tone, your reactions. It's automatic. You're adapting to a set of rules you were never told, but somehow already know. That's because every group has invisible rules, and they shape more of your behavior than you realize. These unspoken codes, who gets to speak, what counts as funny, what topics are off limits, how much honesty is too much, aren't written in a handbook. They're absorbed through repetition, through subtle rewards and punishments, through the anxious reading of a room. You learn not to challenge that one person. You learn which kind of vulnerability makes people lean in and which kind makes them look away. You learn when to perform confidence and when to shrink yourself. And once you do, you fall into formation. This isn't always malicious. It's how humans survive in groups. We are exquisitely attuned to social cues because, evolutionarily, exile used to mean death. So we internalize these group dynamics quickly and often unconsciously. But just because they're natural doesn't mean they're harmless. These invisible rules can punish honesty. They can reward conformity over truth. They can prioritize appearances over authenticity. And because they're rarely questioned, since no one ever officially announced them, they become self-reinforcing. If you break the rule and someone corrects you with a look or silence or sudden exclusion, you're reminded you stepped outside the invisible boundary. Get back in line. The trap is that you often don't know whether these rules are protecting the group or just preserving the comfort of the powerful. In some spaces, the rules uphold empathy. In others, they uphold hierarchy. And most of the time, no one's consciously enforcing them. It's just the shape the system has taken over time. That's what makes this a game theory nightmare. You're playing a multiplayer coordination game where no one agreed on the rules, but everyone enforces them. The only way to win is to conform. The only way to change the game is to risk becoming the outsider. And the more groups you belong to, work, friends, family, identity, online spaces, the more conflicting rule sets you carry. What gets you praise in one group might get you punished in another. So you begin switching masks without noticing. Not to deceive, but to survive. But there's another layer. Sometimes, the group you're adjusting to isn't even external. It's internal. A conversation you're having inside your own mind, based on old rules you learned a long time ago. Childhood dynamics, early relationships, cultural scripts. You've internalized so many invisible rules that even when you're alone, you're still playing by them. And that's where things get really strange. Because whether or not anyone else is watching, you're still being watched by yourself. Judged by standards you didn't choose, controlled by fears you've mistaken for instincts. And just like in every other group, you've learned how to please, how to hide, how to act. Because whether you know it or not, you're playing a game with yourself. You're playing a game with yourself. There's a strange silence no one talks about, the one inside your own mind. Not the calm, meditative kind, but the quiet tension of a room where you're both the judge and the defendant. Every move you make, every decision, every hesitation, you're watching yourself do it. And whether you realize it or not, you're negotiating with yourself in real time. This isn't self-awareness, it's self-management, and it runs deeper than just motivation or procrastination. It's a game A game you didn't agree to play, but one you've never stopped playing either. You want to eat healthier, wake up earlier, say how you really feel. But then you don't. And afterward, you act surprised, even though part of you knew it would happen all along. One version of you made a plan. Another version broke it, and a third one showed up to explain it all away. We often treat these moments as failures of willpower, but they're not accidents. They're bargains. Compromises made between different versions of you, all trying to win a game with different objectives. One version wants comfort. Another wants growth. One wants to speak up. The other wants safety. You call it confusion, but it's actually strategy. Think about how you set your alarms. You know you'll snooze it, but you still set it early. You're gaming your future self, hoping to trap them into doing the right thing, or how you delay starting something, knowing the panic of a looming deadline will force you into action. You call it procrastination, but it's more like emotional blackmail across time. And it doesn't stop at tasks. You practice conversations in your head that will never happen. You imagine worst-case scenarios to emotionally prepare. You rehearse smiles, downplay pain, exaggerate excitement, not for others, but for your own reflection. The inner dialogue becomes a performance. You aren't just being, you're managing perception, even when no one else is watching. This is the metagame of selfhood, where the player and the rules are the same, where guilt, pride, denial, and justification are all tools on a board no one else can see. And the longer you play, the more skilled you become, not at living truthfully, but at narrating your life in a way that feels acceptable to you. You start predicting your own reactions, anticipating your future excuses. You develop emotional workarounds. You avoid situations not because they're dangerous, but because you know what story you'll tell yourself if you fail in them. That fear, that's not fear of the world. It's fear of your own disappointment. Even your most sincere choices are layered. You might pursue something noble, like helping others or creating something beautiful. But in the background, a part of you is keeping score, watching to see if it will earn praise. Meaning, redemption. You're both the author and the audience, and sometimes that makes the entire pursuit feel hollow. It's easy to forget. You're not one mind. You're a negotiation between needs, a swarm of expectations, fears, and memories, all competing for control. What you call a decision is often just the winning argument in a battle no one else witnessed. And this explains why change is so hard. Because to change, you're not just shifting behavior, you're rewriting the rules of the game. You're silencing voices that kept you safe. You're stepping out of strategies that worked, even if they cost you. But maybe there's no winning. Maybe the goal isn't to beat the game, but to recognize you're playing, and to ask, what if the version of you you're trying to become doesn't need to be earned? Still, the mind doesn't rest. It wants structure. It wants explanation. It wants a clean story where logic prevails. But that brings you to the next trap, one that's even harder to escape. The trap of trying to be rational. You've probably been told that the key to making better decisions is to be more rational, more objective, less emotional. That logic will save you from yourself. And at first glance, that makes sense. Who wouldn't want to see clearly, to avoid bias, to outsmart regret? But here's where the trap begins. The pursuit of perfect rationality assumes that you are a detached observer, that you can isolate the variables, run the simulations, and arrive at a correct move, free from fear, pride, or pressure. In reality, you are the variables. You are the context. The act of observing and choosing changes what you're capable of doing. And in the real world, information is never complete. Emotions aren't just noise. They're signals. They're shortcuts. They encode years of experience in a flash of intuition. But when you try to suppress them entirely, you don't become smarter. You just become blind to half the board. Consider this. In game theory, a perfectly rational actor playing against another rational actor can still lose. Why? Because logic is only as good as your assumptions. If you misjudge what the other person values or how they define winning, your strategy collapses. Rationality without empathy is a weapon aimed at the dark. People who obsess over making the right move often get paralyzed. They run endless mental simulations trying to eliminate uncertainty. They overthink relationships, jobs, goals, believing that somewhere out there is an optimal path. But life isn't a math problem. It's a negotiation with chaos. And rationality can't always account for timing, mood, instinct, or the quiet cost of hesitation. There's also the illusion of control. Being rational can feel powerful. It gives you the sense that you're playing above the board, seeing moves no one else can. But often this is just intellectualized fear. You aren't seeking the truth. You're trying to avoid pain. And instead of embracing risk, you analyze it to death. This is how people end up staying in jobs they hate, stuck in relationships that drain them, or chasing goals they no longer believe in. Because on paper, the numbers still make sense. Because they don't want to admit that the real equation includes emotion, desire, and discomfort. And because logic becomes a shield for avoiding hard conversations with themselves. Even morality isn't safe. You can rationalize anything. Betrayal, exploitation, indifference. With enough distance, you can twist any motive into a strategy and convince yourself it was the most reasonable thing to do. And once you've done that, the heart starts to fade from the picture. Decisions become calculations. People become probabilities. Life becomes sterile. This is the trap. When you try to outthink your humanity, you end up losing touch with it. You become so focused on efficiency that you forget about meaning. So obsessed with avoiding error that you stop moving altogether. You begin to wear your rationality like a badge. But underneath, something softer is always asking, what is this all for? You can't logic your way into love. You can't spreadsheet your way into trust. You can't predict your way into peace. Some parts of life are built on leaps, on vulnerability, on letting go of control just long enough to be changed by something real. Because ironically, trying to be fully rational can make you deeply irrational. Not in your conclusions, but in your detachment. You become the player who always folds too early, who never risks, who sees the game but forgets the point. And when that happens, even sincerity starts to decay, because strategy seeps into everything, and suddenly, you're no longer sure if you're being honest or just playing another angle. How strategy destroys sincerity. At first, strategy feels like a superpower. You start seeing patterns where others see chaos. You decode motives. You anticipate reactions. And for a while, that clarity makes you feel safe. Powerful even. Like you're one step ahead in a game that most people don't even know they're playing. But here's the cost no one warns you about. The moment you begin to treat every interaction like a strategy, sincerity starts to rot, not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse. It erodes slowly, one calculated word at a time, one withheld truth, one moment where you pause to wonder how something might look instead of how it really feels. This is the paradox. Strategy requires distance, a bit of detachment. To think like a strategist, you must step outside yourself. You begin to watch, analyze, position. But when you live in that mode too long, you're no longer fully in your own life. You become the narrator instead of the participant. Every act becomes a performance. Every word gets weighed for effect. Every vulnerability is rehearsed, just enough to seem authentic without giving anything real away. At first, it's subtle. You exaggerate a laugh to keep someone engaged. You compliment to disarm. You delay a text reply to preserve mystique. Tiny moves. Harmless, maybe. But over time, you begin to wonder, who are you without the tactics? You start to notice the armor you wear in every conversation. You deflect instead of reveal. You say what's expected instead of what's true. And even when you want to speak plainly, something in you flinches, calculating the risk of being too honest, too raw, too unscripted. The worst part? Strategy works. You get ahead. You charm. You win arguments. You gain followers. But with each win, something real slips further away. You're rewarded not for being you, but for playing well. And so you keep playing. Eventually, even your closest relationships begin to feel off. You wonder if they like you or the version you curated. You catch yourself editing your stories for maximum impact. You hesitate before saying something simple because it doesn't serve a purpose. And slowly, without ever deciding to, you stop showing up as a person and start showing up as a brand. This doesn't just affect others, it affects your own sense of self. Because when you filter everything through, how will this be perceived? You lose access to your inner compass. You no longer know what you genuinely want. You only know what works, what plays, what moves the needle. You might become admired, respected, even envied, but you'll feel strangely hollow inside. Not empty, just disconnected. Like a perfect actor stuck in a role that was once exciting, but now feels claustrophobic. You want to scream, but even that would be too vulnerable, too uncalculated. And then, one day, someone surprises you. They speak without filter. They cry without shame. They love without strategy. And you realize how long it's been since you've done the same. How long you've mistaken control for strength. How deeply you've armored yourself in performance. Because sincerity is messy, it's inefficient, it doesn't always win, but it's the only way to be known. Not managed, not optimized, known. Strategy isn't evil, it's a tool, but when it becomes your identity, it turns everything into a negotiation, even your own reflection. You start to wonder what sincerity would even sound like if you let it speak. What truth would rise up if you stopped filtering for outcome? And when that question starts to haunt you, you realize something even darker. That in a world obsessed with playing to win, there are games where nobody truly does. The game where nobody wins. There's a game most people are playing, even if they don't know its name. A game of appearance, of edge, of carefully curated words and expressions. It plays out in conversations, glances, text messages, status updates, and silences that stretch just long enough to sting. The rules are never taught, they're absorbed. And the goal? To get what you want without ever seeming like you needed it. It sounds subtle, even harmless. But over time, this game swallows sincerity whole. You learn not to ask directly. You imply, you hint, you test the waters. You push just enough to provoke a reaction, but not enough to seem desperate. If you succeed, it feels like you won. But what did you really win? You got the date, the deal, the approval, the upper hand, but not because of who you are, because of how well you played. The game thrives on ambiguity. Nobody says what they mean. Vulnerability is currency, but only when used strategically. Too much, and you're weak. Too little, and you're cold. So you craft a version of yourself that feels human enough to be liked, but polished enough to be envied. Not too honest, not too perfect, just believable. And everyone else is doing it too. That's the tragedy. You perform to be seen, while they perform to see you, and somewhere between all the rehearsed lines, something real tries to break through, but gets buried under lol and NP, and no worries, and I'm good. You both want connection, but neither of you can risk losing the upper hand, so you circle each other, waiting for the other to blink first. In this game, silence becomes a tactic. Timing becomes an art. Detachment becomes a weapon. You're not ghosting because you don't care. You're ghosting because showing care too soon would be losing. You're not withholding because you have nothing to say. You're withholding because saying it would give away your position on the board. Even kindness is leveraged. Compliments are offered when they open doors. Empathy is shown when it costs nothing. Affection is rationed out like treats for good behavior. It all looks like connection, but it's coded in calculation. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to remember what wasn't a move. You start measuring wins and losses not by what actually happened, but by how in control you felt. If someone made you wait, they scored a point. If you made them laugh without trying, you did. If you apologized first, you slipped. If you left them wondering, you climbed. But no one feels satisfied. You get what you wanted, and it doesn't feel like a win. You outmaneuver someone, and you feel hollow. You're admired but not known, desired but not loved. And the longer you play, the more you realize this game doesn't end in victory. It ends in burnout. Because the game wasn't made to be won, it was made to perpetuate itself. It thrives on insecurity, ambiguity, and competition. It feeds on your fear of being too much, too little, too honest, too available, and the longer you play, the more fluent you become in the language of avoidance. What makes it worse is that even when you want to stop, you don't know how. You've spent so long pretending not to care that you've forgotten how to show it. You've used detachment as a shield for so long that dropping it feels like baring your skin to a storm. But here's the bitter truth. Opting out is a risk. Real sincerity may leave you exposed. It may cost you opportunities, or status, or relationships built on gamesmanship. But it may also give you something the game never can. Peace, not applause. Not dominance, just peace. And yet, walking away from the game isn't just about deciding to be honest. It's about unlearning everything that made the game feel necessary. Every social cue that taught you vulnerability is weakness. Every rejection that taught you love has to be earned. Every success that taught you image matters more than truth. Because once you've played long enough, the game becomes instinct. You don't even know you're still playing. You just feel tired, disconnected, unknown. And that's when something else begins to form. A new game, one with no scoreboard, where winning means being understood, and moves are made not to outwit, but to reveal. But to play that one, you'll have to do something radical. You'll have to become readable. And that's when you meet a different kind of strategy entirely, one that doesn't hide, but dares to be seen. The strategy of becoming unreadable. There's a point in every game where the most dangerous player isn't the one who dominates, but the one you can't read, the one who keeps you guessing, who shows just enough to seem honest, but never enough to be predictable, who reacts calmly when expected to explode, and shifts tone just as you begin to trust your footing. In game theory, it's called unpredictability. In real life, it's called protection. And many people live their entire lives behind it. This strategy of becoming unreadable isn't just about surviving social interactions, it's about controlling them. When you make yourself unreadable, you take away your opponent's ability to plan. You leave them uncertain, hesitant. And in a world where people exploit what they understand, that can feel like power. But this power comes at a cost. Because to become unreadable, you have to blur yourself on purpose. You dull your expressions so they reveal nothing. You vary your responses not based on truth, but on effect. You learn to pause at just the right moment, to look away when you feel too seen, to laugh when you're unsettled. People describe you as mysterious, cool under pressure, maybe even hard to get. But beneath the surface, you've simply trained yourself to conceal. It starts small. A moment of vulnerability met with rejection. A truth used against you. A secret you shouldn't have told. And in those moments, something inside you decides, never again. So you tighten up, smile more, say less. You become watchful, selective. The mask doesn't slip because you welded it on. And the more it works, the more you commit. People don't mess with you because they don't know where your limits are. They admire your composure, your control. They project depth onto your silence, meaning onto your pauses. You're always a step ahead. Not because you move faster, but because they move more cautiously. They don't know how you'll react, so they tread lightly. But unreadability is isolating. If no one can predict you, no one can reach you. Relationships become guesses. Conversations become negotiations. You never feel misunderstood because you're never truly known. And after a while, even you forget what parts of you are real and what parts were engineered for survival. You become your own fog. And here's the catch. Once you master unreadability, you start to see everyone else as a player too. You question their motives, their compliments, even their kindness. You think, what do they want from me? Because that's the lens you've learned to see through. Strategy becomes instinct. Suspicion becomes wisdom. Vulnerability becomes naivety. It's easy to justify. In a world full of games, staying unreadable feels smart, but it also means living in a kind of exile, one where connection feels like a liability and intimacy like exposure. You may never be betrayed again, but you'll also never be truly understood. You've won the game by forfeiting something softer, something riskier, something human. But sometimes, the cost of unreadability shows up quietly in late-night loneliness, in friendships that never deepen, in a lover who feels like a stranger, in moments when you want to scream the truth but can't remember how, because staying unreadable too long makes you unreadable even to yourself. And maybe that's the final twist of the strategy, to protect yourself so thoroughly that you end up trapped inside your own design. Still, in every game, there's a shift, a moment when the rules start to crumble. When you realize that the person sitting across from you, confused, careful, second-guessing, might be playing their own version of unreadability too. And maybe they're just as tired, just as cautious, just as lonely. In that moment, something unexpected happens. You put down the mask, not all of it, just a piece, and they do too. Because behind every unreadable player is someone hoping the game might finally end. But what if the game never truly ends? What if it's not about winning or surviving anymore? What if life itself is the unfinished game and the goal is no longer victory, but presence? That's when we turn toward a different thought. One more unsettling, one more freeing, one more real. Life as an unfinished game. Imagine playing a game that never ends. No final move, no scoreboard, no announcement of victory, just a shifting landscape of choices, consequences, and unknowns. That's life. And the more you try to complete it, the more it slips through your hands like sand. In game theory, most models have defined parameters, players, objectives, rules, payoffs. But real life doesn't grant you that clarity. You don't get told when the game begins, what the real stakes are, or who's even playing with you. Sometimes it's not even clear what winning looks like. Is it success, happiness, survival, validation, all of the above? None? That's the trap. We act like the game can be finished if we just try hard enough, as if there's a final version of ourselves waiting on the other side of the right career, the right partner, the right mindset, as if one day the scoreboard will flash. You did it, you won, but that moment never comes. Not really. Because even when you get what you thought you wanted, life just generates a new level, new worries, new pressures, new games to play. You land the job? Now you must keep it. You fall in love? Now you must protect it. You build a reputation? Now you must defend it. It never ends. Every goal achieved opens a new chapter with new uncertainties. Completion is an illusion. And yet, the unfinished nature of the game is what makes it real, what makes it human. If life were a closed system like chess or poker, we'd be predictable. Our strategies would calcify. We'd make decisions based on outcomes, not values. But because life is open-ended, we're forced to live with ambiguity. We make choices without perfect knowledge. We gamble on trust, on love, on meaning, not because we know they'll pay off, but because we hope they will. The truth is, there is no master strategy that guarantees a life well lived. There's no one pattern of behavior that will unlock joy, peace, or clarity forever. And that can feel terrifying, especially in a world obsessed with optimization, with answers, with hacks to everything. But it can also be freeing. Because if the game can't be finished, then maybe the goal isn't to win. It's to play well, to notice the beauty in small moves, to be generous in negotiation, to show courage when the board feels rigged, To accept that not every round will go your way, and that some of your best decisions may never be rewarded. You might never be certain you did it right. You might never get closure, but you can still choose how you move, how you speak, how you respond to loss, to failure, to chaos. And in that choosing, moment by moment, you become the author of your own strategy. Some people will spend their lives chasing a finish line that doesn't exist. Others will step back, smile, and say, maybe the point isn't to finish the game. Maybe it's to feel it, to be awake in it, to show up fully, even when the outcome's unclear. Because life, unlike most games, doesn't reward perfection. It rewards presence. It rewards those who stay curious, who keep adapting, who understand that every ending is just the start of a new rule set. So maybe that's the paradox of the unfinished game. It's not a problem to solve. It's a rhythm to join, a dance to move through with both caution and abandon, and the only real loss is refusing to play at all. And now, as the final thought drifts into silence, let it echo softly in the corners of your mind. You've just wandered through the invisible architecture of human behavior, where strategy hides in smiles, games unfold in silence, and life refuses to follow a single rulebook. Not to overwhelm, but to awaken. To remind you that beneath the everyday, behind each decision, hesitation, and instinct, there's a deeper game always in motion. If something stirred in you tonight, a quiet realization, a question you didn't expect, let it sit. You don't need to answer it. Just carry it with you. Let it change the way you see the people around you, the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you play your own role in this unfinished, beautiful game. If this journey meant something to you, share it with someone who plays the world a little too loudly. Leave a like, leave a thought, or simply subscribe to keep wandering with us through the quiet shadows of the mind and the strange logic of being human. Until next time, rest easy.